I was 17 when it happened. The school counselor handed me this crinkled, faded map like she was doing me a favor. 3 nights, no screens, no noise, just you in the woods, she said like it was some kind of spa retreat. She actually smiled. They called it a therapeutic immersion experience. Part of a new state-funded pilot for kids with chronic absences. Basically, if you skipped enough classes, you got a mandatory camping trip. Lucky me. I remember how her fingers left damp imprints on the paper as she slid it across her desk. The map was old, the kind of old that makes paper feel thin and fragile, like skin that's been left in water too long. The creases were worn white, and there was a stain in one corner that looked disturbingly like dried blood. When I pointed at it, she just laughed, a hollow sound that didn't reach her eyes. Probably coffee, she said, but she wouldn't touch that part of the paper again. My mom didn't even argue when I told her. She just nodded with that distant look she'd had since Dad left, like she was listening to some faraway radio station no one else could hear. It might be good for you, she said, folding laundry that smelled like our moldy basement. Fresh air. She said it like fresh air was some miracle cure for everything wrong with me, everything wrong with us. I packed light, a change of clothes, a flashlight with batteries that I wasn't sure worked, some granola bars, and a water bottle. As an afterthought, I threw in Dad's old hunting knife. Not that I'd ever used it. Not that he'd ever actually hunted anything with it. But it made me feel less vulnerable somehow. The night before I left, I couldn't sleep. My bedroom ceiling seemed to pulse with shadows that didn't match the tree branches outside my window. In the bathroom, the tap dripped with a rhythm that sounded almost deliberate, like Morse code spelling out a warning I couldn't quite decipher. I kept thinking about those woods on the map, how the tree line looked like teeth. I figured I'd be solo. Just me and a tarp in the woods. But when I got to the ranger station near Birch Hollow, there were already 2 other kids standing around looking just as confused. Marcus was jittery and loud, constantly tapping his thighs or bouncing on his toes like he was late for something. Alina stayed silent. She kept pulling the sleeves of her hoodie down over her hands and staring at the floor like she wanted to vanish. I knew their faces from school, but that was it. No one said much. The ranger station itself looked like something from another era. The wood paneling was dark with age, absorbed decades of cigarette smoke and human misery. Faded notices hung on a bulletin board, missing hikers from years past, wildlife warnings that had yellowed at the edges. The glass covering the board was cracked in one corner, spider webbing outward like something had tried to break through from inside. The ranger who met us was a guy named Kerr. Late 40s maybe? Faded shirt, scruffy beard, looked like he hadn't slept properly in a year. He had this campfire smell to him, wood smoke and something musty. He brought us into his office, a tiny wooden room with peeling maps on every wall. One map had a big red circle drawn around a section of hills and forest. Not a perfect circle, more like someone had drawn it quick with a shaking hand. Cabin's right about here, Kerr said, tapping the center. You've got about 2 miles in every direction. That's your safe zone. Stay inside it. Marcus smirked. Safe from what exactly? Bears with clipboards? Kerr didn't smile, just looked at him and said, stay inside it. That was the whole lecture. I noticed something then that made my stomach clench. Kerr's hand, the one that had tapped the map, his fingernails were caked with something dark. Not dirt. Too dark for dirt. And when he caught me looking, he curled his fingers into his palm like he was hiding something. As we gathered our gear, I spotted a logbook on Kerr's desk. It was open to a page that seemed to be tracking something, tallies in groups of 5, dozens of them. Next to each group was a date. The most recent entry was from last week. 5 tallies, followed by a question mark and what looked like dried water spots on the page. Except water doesn't turn paper the particular shade of rust brown. We hiked out about 3 miles to get to the cabin, hauling our gear up a trail that started to vanish the deeper we went. No signs, no markers, just trees. Trees so thick they almost felt arranged. Not random like a forest should be. Too perfect in their spacing, like they'd been planted by something that understood geometry but not nature. The air changed as we walked. It grew heavier, pressing against my skin like a damp cloth. Sounds seemed to get swallowed up, our footsteps, our breathing, even Marcus's constant nervous chatter. Everything muffled, like the forest was cupping a hand over its mouth. By the time we got to the cabin, our shoulders were aching and our socks were soaked through. The cabin looked ancient. Hand-cut logs, one crooked door, two windows with grime so thick you could barely see through. There was a rusted water pump out front and an old propane stove inside. No electricity, definitely no cell signal. Kurt didn't come inside. He just stood at the tree line, watching us unlock the door. "I'll be back in 3 days," he said. His voice sounded different out here, thinner somehow. "Remember, stay in the safe zone." Then he turned and walked away, his footsteps making no sound at all on the carpet of pine needles. The cabin door swung open with a groan that sounded almost human, a long, pained exhalation. Inside, the air was stale and thick with the smell of old wood and something underneath it, something sickly sweet like meat left too long in the sun. But there was no meat, no food of any kind left out. Just 3 cots with thin mattresses, a wood stove, some shelves with basic supplies, and a table with 3 mismatched chairs. On the wall above one cot, someone had carved a series of vertical lines. Counting days, maybe. Or something else. The last few lines were deeper, more frantic, cutting hard into the wood like whoever made them was pressing down with all their strength. That first night was weird, but manageable. We cooked some canned beans, passed around a beat-up deck of cards and tried not to stare too long out the windows. The forest felt off, like the usual background noise had been sucked out. No wind, no birds. Just a long stretch of quiet that didn't feel peaceful so much as paused. Like the woods were holding their breath, waiting for something. The next morning I stepped out to grab some firewood and noticed the pile looked bigger than I remembered. Not by much, but enough. Some of the logs on top looked different too. Wet and dark, like they'd been dug up from a swamp. I figured maybe Kerr had dropped off more wood early, but we hadn't heard anyone. I bent down to inspect one of the new logs. The wood was soft, almost spongy under my fingers. And it was wet, but not with water. The liquid was thicker, more viscous, leaving a dark residue on my skin that smelled of copper and rot. I wiped my hand on my jeans, but the smell lingered, seeping into my pores. When I turned back toward the cabin, I noticed something else. Footprints in the soft earth near the pump. Not our boots, these were different. Narrower, with a strange gait, like whoever left them had been walking on tiptoe or had legs that bent in unusual ways. They circled the cabin once, then disappeared into the underbrush. Not Kerr's boots either. These weren't even shoes. They looked almost like bare feet, except the toes were too long, the arch too pronounced. Inside, Marcus was pacing, tracing the same rectangular path over and over. 6 steps, turn 8 steps, turn 6 steps, turn 8 steps. His eyes kept darting to the windows. "This place feels wrong," he said when he saw me watching him. "Like we're being watched. But not by anything, normal." Alina sat cross-legged on her cot, a small notebook open in her lap. She'd been writing something, her handwriting tiny and cramped. When I glanced at the page, I could only make out a few phrases. "They come at night and the trees aren't trees." She snapped the notebook shut when she realized I was looking. Around mid-morning, Marcus said he was going to check out the ridge. I reminded him about the boundary. He rolled his eyes. "Come on. There's no fence." "Who's gonna know?" Alina didn't say anything. Just watched him go with that same blank look she always wore. Like everything happening around her was just background static. After he left, she finally spoke. "He shouldn't go out there." Her voice was soft, almost a whisper. "The forest doesn't like it when you try to leave." "The forest doesn't like it?" I repeated. What does that mean? She shrugged, pulling her sleeves down over her hands again. This place, it's not right. Haven't you felt it? The way the air feels too thick to breathe sometimes? The way sounds don't travel the way they should? She looked up at me, and for the first time I noticed how unnaturally pale her eyes were, like the color had been leached out. This isn't just a forest. It's something else wearing a forest skin. I laughed, but it came out forced and hollow. That's crazy. It's just trees and dirt. Is it? She pointed to the window. Look at the branches. Really look. I followed her gaze. Outside, the trees stood motionless in the windless air. Their branches stretched toward the cabin, not growing upward like normal trees but reaching horizontally, like arms extended in our direction. And as I watched, though I told myself later it was just a trick of the light, one branch seemed to curl slightly, beckoning. Around noon, I went out to fill the pot at the pump. It sputtered for a second, then spat out this burst of dark, sludgy water before it cleared. I bent down to check the spout, and that's when I felt it. This shift behind me, the air just moved. You know that feeling when someone's standing too close behind you? I turned fast. Nothing, not even a squirrel. But the air where someone should have been standing was warmer than the surrounding space. And for a split second, so brief I almost missed it, I caught a whiff of something acrid and organic, like roadkill baking on hot asphalt. When I got back inside, Alina was sitting on the cot, staring up at the little shelf above the stove. You moved the pans? She asked. No, I shook my head. She pointed. I put the skillet up there. It's gone. We tore the place apart, checked under the beds, behind the stove. Even outside, nothing. It was like the pan had just disappeared. Later that afternoon, Marcus returned from his hike. He was different, quieter, his earlier nervous energy replaced by something more contained, more focused. When I asked what he'd seen up on the ridge, he just shook his head. Nothing. Just trees. But his hands trembled when he said it, and there was a scratch on his neck that hadn't been there before, a single thin line, too straight to be from a branch. At dinner, none of us ate much. The canned stew tasted wrong, metallic and sour, though the expiration date was still months away. As dusk settled, the shadows inside the cabin grew longer, stretching across the floor like fingers reaching for our feet. We found a half-empty bottle of whiskey in one of the cupboards. None of us were big drinkers, but that night we passed it around anyway, each taking small burning sips that did nothing to calm the unease that had settled over us. The liquid inside the bottle looked too dark, almost brown in the fading light, but we drank it anyway. Marcus started talking about the school, about the teachers who reported his absences. They're the reason we're here, he said, his words slightly slurred. They sent us here knowing. Knowing what? I asked when he didn't continue. He looked at me, then at the window, then back to me. This place isn't on any official map, you know. I checked before we came. Birch Hollow doesn't exist. That night, we bolted the door. We didn't even talk about it. We just did it. I dragged one of the heavy chairs in front of it too, wedging it under the handle. No one questioned this. It felt necessary, like locking your car in a bad neighborhood. In the darkness, the cabin creaked and settled around us. The sounds weren't random, they had a pattern to them, almost like footsteps circling the ceiling. Tap, drag, pause. Tap, drag, pause. Over and over. I woke up sometime after 1. Something was brushing the window, not tapping, brushing, like a hand wrapped in fabric slowly dragging across the glass. I sat up and across the room, Marcus was already awake. He was staring at the same window. His face was pale, eyes locked. Neither of us moved. We didn't even breathe. The brushing stopped. Then, slowly, the glass began to fog, but only in one spot, a perfect circle about the size of a dinner plate. And in that foggy circle, a finger or something like a finger began to draw. Not random patterns. Letters. A single word, backward from our perspective but still legible, welcome. Marcus opened his mouth as if to scream, but no sound came out. The fog on the window dissipated, leaving no trace of the writing, no evidence that anything had been there at all. Except for a single, dark smudge where the last letter had been. In the morning we opened the door and found the skillet sitting on the porch, upside down, covered in pine needles, like someone or something had placed it there carefully. Marcus tried to joke, probably a raccoon, a really organized raccoon. We didn't laugh. The skillet wasn't just covered in pine needles, they were arranged in a perfect spiral on its underside, pressed into a thin layer of something sticky and dark that had the metallic tang of blood when I leaned close to inspect it. At the center of the spiral was a tiny, yellow tooth. Not human, but not quite animal either. Something in between. Then we saw the woodpile, or where it used to be. In its place was a ring, a neat, perfect ring of dead animals. Squirrels, rabbits, even a raccoon, gutted, split open like someone was trying to see inside the bones. A few were positioned with their faces tilted up, but none had eyes. Marcus turned away and puked. Alina didn't react at all. She just walked back inside, zipped her backpack and sat down. I couldn't look away from the circle. The precision of it was the most disturbing part. Each animal placed exactly the same distance from the next, their bodies aligned so that they all faced inward, toward an empty center. And that center was a perfect circle of bare earth where nothing grew, not even moss. The soil there looked different, darker, almost black, with a strange oily sheen. As I stared, I noticed something else. The animals hadn't been killed by any normal predator. There were no tooth marks, no signs of a struggle. Each had been split open with surgical precision, a single clean line from throat to tail. And their organs weren't just removed, they were missing entirely. No blood, no mess. Just clean, empty cavities, pale ribs gleaming in the morning light. Back inside, we didn't vote on leaving. We didn't argue. We just started packing. The silence between us was heavy with unspoken fear, the kind that sits in your stomach like lead. Alina broke it first. They won't let us leave. Her voice was flat, emotionless. But we can try. Who's they? Marcus demanded, his earlier bravado completely gone. What did you see? What do you know? She just shook her head, that same blank expression on her face. But there was something new in her eyes now, a flicker of something that might have been pity. We left everything we didn't absolutely need. The less to carry, the faster we could move. I brought only my backpack with water, the hunting knife, and what was left of our food. Marcus stuffed his phone in his pocket, even though it hadn't had signal since we arrived. Alina took nothing but her notebook. Outside, the morning that should have been bright and clear was instead hazy, the sunlight filtering through a thin mist that hadn't been there minutes before. The air smelled wrong, not the clean pine scent of a forest, but something older, more primal. Like turned earth and decay. The trail out was gone. I mean, there were trails, but none of them looked right. Trees repeated, we passed a stump 3 times. Distances didn't make sense. After walking for 20 minutes, we were still in view of the cabin. Then, suddenly, we weren't. The forest around us grew denser, the spaces between trees shrinking until branches clawed at our clothes and hair as we pushed through. The ground beneath our feet grew soggy, each step producing a wet, sucking sound that seemed to echo longer than it should. Twice we crossed small streams that weren't on the map, their waters moving sluggishly, thick with sediment that looked disturbingly like ash. In one, I saw something pale just below the surface, a hand, I thought at first, reaching up. But when I looked again, it was just a gnarled root, twisted into a shape that only resembled fingers if you were already primed to see them. We're going in circles, Marcus said after an hour, his voice cracking with strain. This isn't working. We need to keep going, I insisted. Kerr said the boundary was 2 miles. We can't have gone that far yet. Kerr, Alina said the name like it tasted bitter. Do you really think he's coming back for us? Do you really think anyone is? Then we found the boots. Hanging from a low branch, swinging gently, the name stitched on the tongue was Kerr. His uniform pants were crammed inside the boots. Dried blood had soaked through the fabric and turned the legs stiff. They swayed slightly in a breeze we couldn't feel, creaking against the leather laces that bound them to the branch. A perfect knot, the kind that takes practice to tie. And beneath them, the crown was bare in a perfect circle, just like the one where the woodpile had been. Looking closer at the boots, I saw that they weren't just blood-stained. The leather itself was scored with dozens of tiny marks, not random scratches but deliberate patterns. Whorls and lines that formed shapes that almost made sense, almost like letters in an alphabet I'd never seen but somehow recognized. And stuffed down into the toe of one boot was a folded piece of paper, the edge just visible. I reached for it, but Alina grabbed my wrist. Her grip was surprisingly strong, her fingers digging into my skin. "Don't," she whispered. "Don't touch it. That's how they find you. Marcus lost it." He screamed something and tore off into the trees. I yelled after him, but he didn't stop. His figure grew smaller as he ran, until the forest swallowed him completely. Alina and I stuck to the path, if you could call it that. Every few minutes we'd hear something following. Not close, but not far enough to ignore. Crunching leaves, a low dragging sound, and always just behind us. Whenever we stopped to listen, it stopped too. Whenever we moved, it followed. Once, I caught a glimpse of it between the trees, a dark shape, hunched and wrong, moving with a jerking gait that reminded me of those stop-motion monsters from old horror films. But it was gone before I could focus on it, leaving only the impression of something tall and thin that bent in ways nothing should bend. The forest grew darker around us, though it couldn't have been past midday. The trees grew taller, their canopies meshing overhead until only thin shafts of light penetrated to the forest floor. The air grew colder too, with a damp chill that seeped through our clothes and into our bones. "We need to find Marcus," I said, trying to keep the panic out of my voice. "We can't just leave him out here." Alina didn't respond at first, her eyes fixed on something in the distance. "I don't think it matters now," she said finally. "I don't think any of it matters." "What are you talking about?" "Of course it." She cut me off, pointing ahead. "We're here." Then came the clearing. It opened up without warning. 1 second we were pushing through underbrush, the next we were standing in front of a soot-blackened chimney. No house, just the chimney, cracked all the way up, standing like a monument. The foundation around it had burned long ago, only scraps of wood remained, half buried under moss. But there were carvings everywhere. Runes. On the chimney stones. On the trees, even on a bone that someone had jammed into the dirt with twine. Humanish, maybe, but all wrong. Mouths open too wide, spiraled. No eyes. Just hollow spaces where eyes should have been. The clearing was perfectly circular, unnaturally so, as if someone had used a compass to draw it. The grass grew differently here, sparser, yellowed, with patches of bare earth that formed patterns if you looked at them from the right angle. Patterns that hurt my eyes to follow. The chimney dominated the space, rising at least 15 feet into the air. Its stones were blackened not just with soot but with something that looked more deliberate, dark streaks that ran down the sides in vertical lines, too even to be from a natural fire. At its base, a pile of ash still remained, though any fire must have died years ago. The ash wasn't gray but a deep, rusty red. Alina moved toward it as if in a trance, her steps slow but purposeful. "This is where it happened," she whispered. "This is where they come through." Or what happened? Who comes through? My voice sounded thin and childish even to my own ears. She ignored me, reaching out to touch one of the carvings on the chimney stone. It depicted a figure vaguely human in shape but with proportions all wrong. Too many joints in the limbs, the head cocked at an impossible angle. Its hands were elongated into claws, and where its eyes should have been were just smooth, blank spaces. "They've been watching us since we arrived," Alina said, her finger tracing the carving. "Testing us. Seeing if we're suitable." Suitable for what? A cold dread was building in my stomach, a certainty that I didn't want to hear her answer. For joining them. She turned to face me, and her expression had changed. The blankness was gone, replaced by something almost like excitement. "They need new ones, you see. The old ones were out eventually." They need fresh eyes. I took a step back. Alina, you're not making sense. We need to find Marcus and get back to the ranger station. Marcus is already with them. She gestured to the surrounding forest. Can't you feel it? The watching. They're all around us now. And I could feel it, that same sensation I had at the water pump, of being observed by something just out of sight. The air in the clearing felt charged, electric, like the moment before lightning strikes. The carvings on the chimney stones seemed to shift in my peripheral vision, the figures moving when I wasn't looking directly at them. And the sounds, subtle at first, then unmistakable, rustling in the underbrush, twigs snapping, a low hum that might have been the wind but wasn't. We were chosen, Alina continued, her voice taking on a rhythmic quality, almost like she was reciting something memorized. All of us. Not randomly. Not because we skipped school. Because we were already marked. Already seeing things others couldn't see. A memory surfaced, the school counselor's face as she handed me the map, that knowing smile that didn't reach her eyes. The way she'd avoided touching the bloodstain in the corner. Had she known? Had she been sending us here deliberately? I don't understand, I said, my voice breaking. What is this place? What's happening to us? Alina stepped closer, too close, invading my space. Her eyes looked different now, the pupils expanded until there was almost no iris left, just black pools that reflected nothing. This place is old, she said, her breath visible in the suddenly cold air. Older than the forest. Older than the mountains. It was here before people, and it will be here after. It just wants company sometimes. I backed away, my hand finding the knife in my pocket. Not that it would do any good against whatever was happening here. But its solid weight was reassuring nonetheless. Look, I said, trying to keep my voice steady. We need to leave. Now. This place is messing with our heads. Alina smiled, a sad expression that transformed her face. For a moment, she looked almost normal again. It's too late for that. It was too late when we stepped off the bus. That's when I saw it, movement at the tree line. A figure emerging from between the trunks. Marcus. But not Marcus. His body moved wrong, joints bending in directions they shouldn't. His face was slack, expressionless, eyes wide and unblinking. And behind him, other shapes were taking form, stepping from shadow into the dim light of the clearing. They were tall, taller than any person should be, with limbs that seemed too numerous, too jointed. Their bodies weren't quite solid, they shifted and flowed like smoke given temporary form. And their faces, what I could see of them, were just like the carvings. Mouths too wide, spiraling inward. No eyes. Just smooth skin where eyes should be. They need eyes, Alina whispered, her own gaze fixed on the approaching figures. They lost theirs long ago. That's the price for what they became. That's why they bring us here. Young eyes. Fresh eyes. Something clicked into place, the circle of eyeless animals. The carvings with their blank gazes. Even Kerr's boots, hanging from the tree, his body nowhere to be found. Marcus shambled closer, moving like a puppet controlled by unpracticed hands. His eyes were different too, cloudy, unfocused, yet somehow still aware. Aware and screaming silently. Alina whispered, "We're not the first." Then something shifted behind the chimney. I didn't stop to look. I grabbed her arm and we ran. No planning, no idea where we were headed, just ran until the trees thinned and gravel crunched under our feet. We hit the service road and collapsed. Not long after, a state trooper's SUV rolled up. He said he was checking on the ranger, who missed a call in. The trooper looked young, his uniform still crisp with newness. His name tag read Davis. He frowned as he took in our disheveled appearance, the wild look in our eyes, the scratches on our arms and faces from branches we pushed through. "You kids from that program?" he asked, already reaching for his radio. "Where's your guide? Where's Ranger Kerr?" I couldn't speak. My throat felt raw from running, from the scream I didn't remember releasing. Beside me, Alina was unnaturally calm, her breathing already steady, her face composed. "We got separated," she said, her voice perfectly normal. Nothing like the trance-like tone she had at the chimney. "We were trying to find our way back to the cabin when we got lost." The trooper's frown deepened. "And the other kid?" "The file said there were 3 of you." "Marcus," I managed to croak. "He's still out there. We have to go back for him." Davis nodded, already on his radio calling for backup. "Stay here," he instructed, handing us a thermal blanket from his trunk. "Rescue team will be here in 20. We'll find your friend." But they didn't find Marcus. Not that day, not in the days that followed. The search stretched into a week, then 2. Dogs lost his scent at the edge of a stream. Helicopters saw nothing but unbroken forest canopy. It was as if he'd simply vanished. They found the cabin easily enough, exactly where it was supposed to be according to the coordinates. But it looked different somehow in the daylight, with other people around. Smaller. More ordinary. Just an old hunting cabin, nothing sinister about it. The woodpile was just a woodpile, no circle of dead animals, no bare earth in the center. The boots we'd found hanging from the tree were nowhere to be seen. When I tried to describe them, to explain about Kerr's name stitched inside, the search team exchanged glances. "Ranger Kerr is on leave," one of them told me gently, as if speaking to a child. "Has been for months. That's why we got worried when no one checked in. The replacement ranger was supposed to meet you kids at the drop-off point. But no replacement had ever shown up. Just Kerr, or someone we thought was Kerr." The chimney clearing was the strangest part. We led them there, retracing our steps exactly. But where we'd seen a burned foundation and a towering chimney covered in carvings, they found only a small, unremarkable clearing with a pile of old stones in the center. No carvings. No runes. Just weathered rocks that might once have been part of a structure but had long since collapsed. "Probably an old settler's cabin," one of the search teams said with a shrug. "These woods are full of them." They didn't see what I saw, the way the grass still grew in that perfect circle, the way the trees around the clearing bent slightly inward, reaching. They didn't feel the watching presence I still felt, even surrounded by a dozen armed rangers. They took us back to town, to the hospital first for a checkup, then to the police station for questioning. Our stories diverged almost immediately. I told them everything: the disappearing skillet, the circle of dead animals, the carvings on the chimney, the figures in the forest. The things Alina had said about them needing eyes. Alina told them we'd simply gotten lost. That Marcus had wandered off on his own and we tried to find him but couldn't. That we'd been scared, tired, and dehydrated, our minds playing tricks on us. Guess which version they believed. My parents were called. My mother cried, alternating between hugging me and yelling about lawsuits against the school district. Doctors prescribed sedatives and therapy. Everyone treated me like I was fragile, breakable. No one actually listened. Except for one detective. Older than the others, with gray hair and eyes that had seen too much. He pulled me aside after one of the debriefings, away from the others. "This isn't the first time," he said quietly, making sure no one could overhear. "That program, 3 years ago, we had another group. Different kids, different part of the forest. One never came back." My heart pounded. Did they see things too? Like we did? He nodded slowly. "The ones who made it out. They talked about carvings. About circles in the earth. About eyes." He glanced around nervously. "Look, officially, we called it exposure and disorientation. The missing kid, we assumed he fell into a ravine or something. But I've been in those woods my whole life, and there are parts." He trailed off, then reached into his pocket and pressed something into my hand. "Found this near where you said the chimney was. Official report doesn't mention it." It was a small, smooth stone, polished to a high shine. Carved into its surface was a familiar symbol, a spiral surrounded by what looked like elongated fingers. Or maybe branches reaching inward. "Keep it hidden," he advised. "And maybe don't go back to those woods. Ever." I haven't. I switched schools after that, convinced my mom to move to a different district. I haven't seen Alina since the final debriefing, though I've looked for her online. It's like she disappeared too, in her own way. Marcus was officially declared missing, presumed dead after 6 months. His parents still put up flyers sometimes. His face smiles from faded paper on community bulletin boards, under the word missing in bold red letters. The same face I sometimes see in my dreams, moving on, eyes clouded but aware. Watching. Sometimes I wake in the night to find my room colder than it should be, the shadows deeper in the corners. And sometimes, in that space between sleeping and waking, I swear I can hear a sound like branches scraping against glass. Like something trying to get in. Or maybe, like something reminding me it's still there. Still waiting. Because the most terrifying thing isn't what happened in those woods. It's knowing that it's still happening. That right now, some other teenager is being handed a faded map with a red circle drawn on it. Some other ranger who isn't really a ranger is leading them down a trail that disappears behind them. Some other eyes are being prepared. And sometimes, when I look in the mirror, I swear my own eyes look different now. Darker. Older. Like they've seen things they shouldn't have. Like part of me is still there, in that clearing, watching the things that emerge from behind the chimney. Watching, and being watched in return. My name is Miguel Vasquez, and I've spent most of my life navigating the wildest, most dangerous places in the Southwest. I'm a search and rescue specialist, or at least I used to be. These days I try to avoid the canyons. They're beautiful, sure, but they're also full of secrets that don't want to be found. The phone call came on a Tuesday morning in July, 1983. The heat wave had already been strangling the desert for 2 weeks, turning the air into something thick and malevolent that pressed against your skin like wet wool. Even the lizards had given up, hiding in whatever shade they could find. The thermometer outside my trailer read 118 degrees, and it wasn't even noon. Miguel? It's Gary. The voice on the other end belonged to Gary Henderson, a park supervisor I'd worked with before my suspension. His tone carried the particular mix of desperation and authority that meant trouble. I need you to guide a research team into the restricted section of Canyonlands. The restricted section. The words sent ice through my veins despite the crushing heat. I'd heard the stories about that place, whispered around campfires by rangers who'd worked the area for decades. Old-timers who refused to patrol certain sectors after dark, who spoke in hushed tones about equipment that moved by itself and voices that called from empty canyons. Gary, you know I can't. The suspension's over as of today, he interrupted. Look, Miguel, I wouldn't ask if it wasn't important. This team has some serious backing from the university. They're paying good money. Good money. After a year of scraping by on odd jobs and handyman work, those were magic words. But something cold crawled up my spine as I stared out at the shimmering heat waves rising from the desert floor. My grandfather's voice echoed in my memory, speaking in rapid Navajo about places where the earth itself was sick, where ancient boundaries had been drawn for reasons lost to time. What kind of research? I asked, though I already suspected I wouldn't like the answer. Archaeological. Petroglyphs, mostly. They want to document some newly uncovered sites before the winter rains damage them. Newly uncovered. That's what they were calling it. 3 months ago, an earthquake had shifted the canyon walls, revealing chambers and passages that hadn't seen daylight in centuries. The tremor had been minor by geological standards, barely registering on seismographs, but it had done something to the restricted section that made even the hardiest park rangers uncomfortable. Who's on the team? Dr. Diane Foster from the university's anthropology department. Specialist in ancient southwestern cultures. Her graduate student, Anthony Williams, kid's some kind of prodigy with translation work. Professor James Harrington from the archaeology department, and they're bringing Ranger Kyle Peterson along for additional security. Kyle Peterson. I heard about him, young hotshot fresh from training, the kind who thought local legends were quaint folklore for tourists. The kind who didn't understand that some warnings existed for good reasons. Gary, you know what the locals say about that area. A pause. When Gary spoke again, his voice was careful, measured. Miguel, I need someone out there who understands the terrain. Someone who respects it. The team leaves Friday morning whether you're with them or not. I'd rather it be you. The implication hung in the air like smoke. If I didn't go, he'd send someone else, someone who might not come back at all. The desert had a way of claiming people who ventured into the wrong places with the wrong intentions. Better to be there, to try to keep them safe, than to read about their disappearance in the papers. What's the pay? I asked, already knowing I'd accept. $5,000. For a week's work. $5,000. More than I'd made in the past 6 months combined. Enough to get caught up on bills, maybe even put some aside. But as I hung up the phone, my hands were shaking, and it wasn't from the heat. Friday morning arrived with a sky the color of old brass, heavy and oppressive despite the early hour. I met the team at the park headquarters, a low building that squatted against the horizon like something waiting to spring. The parking lot shimmered with heat mirages even though the sun had barely cleared the eastern peaks. Dr. Diane Foster was exactly what I'd expected, mid-40s, sharp-featured, with the kind of intense focus that made you feel like a specimen under a microscope. She wore practical field clothes but moved with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her orders followed without question. Her handshake was firm, almost aggressive. Mr. Vasquez. Gary tells me you're the best guide in the area. I know the terrain, I said carefully. Anthony Williams stood slightly behind her, a thin young man in his early 20s with nervous energy that made him fidget with his notebook constantly. His eyes darted between the team members and the horizon beyond, as if he were already cataloging escape routes. When he shook my hand, his palm was damp with sweat. Anthony's been studying the regional petroglyphs for his dissertation, Dr. Foster explained. He has a remarkable talent for translation work. The kid nodded but didn't speak. Something in his expression suggested he'd rather be anywhere else. Professor James Harrington was older, maybe 60, with the weathered look of someone who'd spent decades in the field. He wore a hat that had seen better years and boots that were practical rather than fashionable. When our eyes met, I saw something there, a flicker of recognition, maybe even concern. Like he knew more about our destination than he was letting on. Professor, I said, extending my hand. Miguel. His grip was steady, but his eyes kept drifting toward the desert. Beautiful country out here. Ancient. Full of history. The way he said that last word made my skin crawl. Ranger Kyle Peterson was everything I'd expected and worse. Early 30s, built like he spent too much time in the gym, with the kind of swagger that came from thinking a badge and a uniform made you invincible. He looked at me like I was an unnecessary addition to his operation. So you're the local expert, he said, not bothering to eye his skepticism. Gary filled me in on your situation. My suspension. He was talking about my suspension, which had happened after I'd refused to guide a film crew into a sacred burial site. The Park Service had called it insubordination. I'd called it respect for the dead. I know these canyons, I said simply. Right. Well, just so we're clear, I'm the law enforcement presence on this expedition. My word is final when it comes to safety decisions. I nodded, but something in my gut was already churning. Peterson was the kind of man who confused authority with wisdom, who would push forward when he should retreat. The desert didn't care about badges or regulations. It only cared about respect, and Peterson had none to give. As we loaded our gear into the Park Service vehicles, Dr. Foster spread a map across the hood of the lead truck. The restricted section was marked in red, a roughly rectangular area that encompassed some of the most remote and dangerous terrain in the park. The earthquake damage was noted with small triangles, marking where new passages had opened and old ones had collapsed. We'll be focusing on this area here, she said, pointing to a cluster of triangles deep in the canyon system. Satellite imagery shows evidence of previously hidden chambers, possibly containing significant petroglyphic art. I studied the map, noting the elevation changes and the narrow passages that would funnel us deeper into the canyon's heart. Once we were in there, There would be only one way out. If something went wrong, how long are we planning to stay? I asked. Initial expedition is scheduled for 5 days, Dr. Foster replied. Depending on what we find, we may extend. 5 days. In normal circumstances, that would be nothing. I'd spent weeks at a time in the backcountry, guiding hunters and researchers through terrain that would challenge experienced climbers. But the restricted section wasn't normal circumstances. Even before the earthquake, it had been off limits for reasons that went beyond simple safety concerns. As we drove toward the canyon access road, I watched the landscape change around us. The higher desert gave way to red rock formations that jutted from the earth like broken bones. The temperature climbed steadily, and the air grew heavy with dust from recent storms. In the distance, the canyon walls rose like fortress ramparts, their shadows dark and impenetrable. My radio crackled to life. Miguel, you copy? It was Gary's voice, tight with something that might have been concern. Copy, Gary. Just wanted to remind you, if anything feels wrong out there, anything at all, you get that team out. No heroics, no pushing through. You understand? Understood. But as I signed off and watched the canyon mouth growing larger ahead of us, I wondered if Gary knew something he wasn't telling me. Something about why the section had really been restricted, about what the earthquake had truly uncovered. The vehicle's air conditioning fought a losing battle against the heat, and by the time we reached the end of the access road, the interior of the truck felt like an oven. As we unloaded our gear and prepared for the hike into the canyon, I caught Anthony Williams staring at the rock walls with an expression I couldn't quite read. Something wrong? I asked. He startled, then glanced at Dr. Foster before answering. Just the petroglyphs I've been studying. Some of them contain warnings. About certain areas, certain practices. He lowered his voice. Places where the boundaries between worlds grow thin. Kid's been reading too many ghost stories, Peterson interjected, hefting his pack with exaggerated ease. It's just rock and sand out here. But as we began our descent into the canyon, following a trail that seemed to wind deeper into the earth's shadow with each step, I found myself thinking about boundaries. About the old maps my grandfather had shown me as a child, maps that marked certain areas with ancient symbols and the words, "Here be dragons." The walls closed in around us, and the temperature began to drop despite the scorching heat above. Our footsteps echoed strangely in the narrow passages, and I could swear I heard them coming back to us seconds later, as if the canyon itself were walking behind us. 5 days, I told myself. 5 days, and then we'd be out of here. But as the shadows deepened and the walls grew closer, I had the uncomfortable feeling that the canyon had different plans for us entirely. The descent into the restricted section took most of the morning. What had started as a well-defined trail gradually narrowed into a series of switchbacks carved into living rock, each turn taking us deeper into a landscape that felt increasingly hostile. The walls rose higher with each step, blocking out more and more of the sky until we walked in a perpetual twilight that made checking our watches feel necessary. Anthony Williams had grown quieter as we descended, occasionally stopping to photograph petroglyphs carved into the canyon walls. The symbols were older than anything I'd seen before, and they seemed to follow certain patterns that made my skin crawl. Spirals within spirals, human figures with too many limbs, and everywhere, the repeated image of something that might have been a man but wasn't quite right. These are extraordinary, Dr. Foster breathed, running her fingers over a panel of carvings that stretched 12 feet across a flat section of wall. Anthony, what do you make of the sequence here? Williams consulted his notebook, cross-referencing symbols with translations he prepared. His hand shook slightly as he turned the pages. It's a warning, I think. Something about shapeshifters. The text is fragmented, but it mentions rituals and boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. Boundaries? Professor Harrington had approached quietly, his expression troubled. What kind of boundaries? Between worlds. Between what is and what should remain hidden. Williams looked up from his notebook, his face pale. Dr. Foster, maybe we should. Document everything, she interrupted, already pulling out her camera. These could represent a completely unknown dialect. This could revolutionize our understanding of pre-Columbian cultures in this region. Peterson rolled his eyes and spat into the dust. Just a bunch of old scratches in the rock. Probably made by bored kids 100 years ago. I wanted to tell him that these carvings were far older than 100 years, that I'd seen similar symbols in sacred sites my grandfather had shown me as a child. Instead, I studied the canyon walls, noting how the shadows seemed to move in ways that didn't match the sun's position. The air down here was cooler, but it carried strange currents that made dust dance in spirals even when there was no wind. We pressed deeper into the canyon system, following GPS coordinates that Dr. Foster had obtained through university channels she wouldn't elaborate on. The path split several times, branching into passages that disappeared into absolute darkness. Each time we encountered a junction, she would consult her notes and choose our direction with absolute certainty. "How do you know which way to go?" I asked during one of our brief rest stops. "Geological surveys," she replied, but something in her tone suggested there was more to it than that. The earthquake damage created new access points to chambers that have been sealed for centuries. We have very specific coordinates. Professor Harrington was examining a section of wall where the recent earthquake had created a crack wide enough for a person to squeeze through. "Miguel, have you ever been in this specific area before?" "No," I admitted. The restricted section has been off limits since before I started working for the Park Service. Even the old-timers avoid it. "Why?" Williams asked, looking up from his sketching. I thought about how to explain it without sounding like I believed in ghost stories. Disappearances, mostly. People who came out here and never came back. Equipment that malfunctioned for no reason. Rangers who reported unusual experiences. Such as? Dr. Foster had stopped taking photographs and was giving me her full attention. Voices calling from empty canyons. Footprints that appeared overnight in places no one had walked. Equipment that was rearranged while people slept. I paused, remembering stories my grandfather had told me. Animals that behaved strangely. Dogs that refused to enter certain areas, horses that would bolt rather than follow certain trails. Peterson snorted. Probably just echo effects and wild animals. This place isn't supernatural, it's just remote. But even as he spoke, I noticed that his voice sounded different here, flatter somehow, as if the canyon walls were absorbing the sound rather than reflecting it. When we called to each other across short distances, our voices seemed to return to us changed, subtly altered in pitch and tone. We reached our first major destination in the early afternoon, a chamber that the earthquake had exposed by collapsing part of the canyon wall. The opening was irregular, roughly 8 feet wide and partially blocked by fallen stones. Dr. Foster played her flashlight beam into the darkness beyond, illuminating walls covered in petroglyphs that seemed to move in the shifting light. "This is it," she whispered, and there was something in her voice that sounded almost religious. "This is what we came for." The chamber was larger than it had appeared from outside, its ceiling lost in shadows above the reach of our flashlights. The walls were covered floor to ceiling with carvings, layer upon layer of symbols that seemed to tell a continuous story. But as Anthony Williams began to translate sections of the text, the story that emerged was deeply unsettling. "It's about transformation," he said, his voice echoing strangely in the enclosed space. "About people who made deals with entities. They gained the power to change their shape, to walk in forms that weren't their own." "Skinwalkers," I said quietly. Williams nodded, his face grim. But these weren't just random legends. According to this, there was a specific ritual. A specific place where these transformations occurred. He pointed to a section of wall where the carvings seemed to form a map. "And I think we're in it." Dr. Foster was documenting everything with manic intensity, taking hundreds of photographs from every angle. "This is extraordinary. These carvings predate anything we found in this region by centuries, possibly millennia." Professor Harrington, meanwhile, had been exploring the deeper sections of the chamber. "You need to see this," he called from the shadows. We followed his voice to the back of the chamber, where our flashlight beams revealed something that made my blood run cold. The floor was covered in footprints, dozens of them, maybe hundreds, pressed into what had once been soft clay and now hardened into permanent impressions. They were of different sizes, different shapes, as if a crowd of people had gathered here for some purpose. But as I knelt to examine them more closely, I realized something that made my stomach drop. The footprints weren't just from different people, they were from different kinds of feet. Human prints mixed with animal paws, clawed impressions that could have belonged to predators, and shapes that didn't match anything I could identify. "This is where they came," Williams whispered, consulting his notebook with trembling hands. "This is where the rituals took place. Where people became something else." Peterson kicked at one of the impressions with his boot. "Just old mud, dried and cracked. You're all seeing patterns that aren't there." But even as he spoke, I noticed something that made my hair stand on end. Near the edge of the chamber, barely visible in the dim light, were footprints that looked fresh. The clay around them was darker, as if it had been disturbed recently. And the prints themselves, they matched our boots. I grabbed Anthony's arm. "Look at those prints over there. Do they look familiar?" He followed my gaze and his face went white. Those are ours. From our boots." "That's impossible," Dr. Foster said, but she was already moving toward the prints, her camera ready. "We just got here." The footprints were perfect matches for our hiking boots, down to the distinctive tread patterns and more marks. But they weren't just scattered randomly, they were arranged in a deliberate pattern, forming a circle around a central area where the clay had been smoothed flat. "We need to leave," I said, my voice sharp with urgency. "Right now." "We just got here," Peterson protested. "These are probably from some previous expedition that—" "No." Williams was backing toward the chamber entrance, his notebook clutched against his chest. "No previous expeditions. This area has been sealed since the earthquake 3 months ago. These prints—" He swallowed hard. "These prints are from us. But we haven't walked in that pattern." As if to punctuate his words, a sound echoed through the chamber, a low, rhythmic tapping, like someone walking across stone. But we were all standing still. The tapping stopped. Then started again, closer this time. "Everyone out," I ordered, but Dr. Foster was still taking photographs, seemingly oblivious to the danger. "Just a few more shots," she insisted. "This could be the discovery of the century." The tapping sound stopped abruptly, replaced by something worse, silence so complete it felt like a weight pressing against our eardrums. In that silence, I heard something that made my skin crawl, breathing that wasn't coming from any of us, slow and deliberate, as if something large was inhaling and exhaling just beyond the reach of our lights. "Dr. Foster," I said firmly, "we're leaving. Now." Something in my tone must have finally penetrated her scientific fervor, because she looked up from her camera and really saw our faces for the first time. Williams was pale and shaking, Professor Harrington had backed against the chamber wall, and even Peterson looked uneasy. "All right," she said reluctantly. "We can return tomorrow with better equipment." As we filed out of the chamber, I cast one last look back at the footprints in the clay. For just a moment, in the shifting light of our flashlights, they seemed to move, not the prints themselves, but the shadows around them, as if something invisible was walking among them. We made camp a quarter-mile from the chamber, in a relatively open area where several canyons converged. It was the kind of location my grandfather would have approved of, defensible, with multiple escape routes, and far enough from enclosed spaces that we could see anything approaching. But as evening fell and the canyon walls transformed into black monoliths against the star-filled sky, I realized that being able to see what was coming might not be enough. We set up our tents in a rough circle around a central fire pit, following standard backcountry protocol. Peterson insisted on taking the first watch, despite my suggestion that we should all stay together. Williams had been silent since leaving the chamber, occasionally scribbling in his notebook but otherwise staring into the flames with an expression of growing dread. "What else do those petroglyphs say?" I asked him as we prepared our evening meal. He looked up from his notebook, his face gaunt in the firelight. "They talk about the consequences. About what happens to people who enter the sacred spaces without permission." He paused, turning a page. "About things that learn to wear human faces." Dr. Foster, who had been reviewing her photographs on the back of her camera, suddenly looked up. "That's strange. Anthony, look at this image." She handed him the camera, and his face went even paler as he studied the small screen. That's not right. What is it? Professor Harrington asked. William showed us the image, one of the photographs Dr. Foster had taken inside the chamber. It showed the wall of petroglyphs clearly, but in the background, just barely visible in the shadows, was a figure. A human silhouette that none of us remembered seeing when the photograph was taken. Camera glitch, Peterson said from his position at the edge of our camp. Weird lighting effects. But as Dr. Foster scrolled through more images, we found the figure in 17 different photographs, always in the background, always partially obscured by shadows. In some images it appeared to be standing. In others, it seemed to be moving. And in the final few photographs, it appeared to be walking toward the camera. We need to go back, William said suddenly. We need to go back and perform a cleansing ritual. These carvings, they're not just historical records, they're warnings. And we've already violated them just by being here. Don't be ridiculous, Dr. Foster snapped, but there was uncertainty in her voice now. There's a logical explanation for all of this. As if summoned by her words, our equipment began to malfunction. The GPS unit started showing coordinates that placed us in impossible locations, sometimes underwater, sometimes hundreds of miles away. The digital cameras would work normally for a few shots, then display images of places none of us had been. And the radio, which had been working perfectly all day, now produced only static punctuated by what sounded like voices speaking in a language none of us recognized. Just electromagnetic interference, Peterson insisted, but his voice lacked conviction. These canyons can cause weird effects with electronic equipment. The wind picked up as true darkness fell, carrying sounds that made us all look nervously toward the canyon walls. Sometimes it sounded like voices calling from the darkness, distant but distinct enough that we found ourselves straining to listen. Other times it carried what sounded like footsteps, slow and deliberate, circling our camp just beyond the reach of our firelight. I was checking the perimeter when I found them, the footprints in the sand around our camp. They formed a perfect circle, maybe 50 feet in diameter, with our tents at the center. Fresh prints, pressed deep into the sand as if made by someone carrying significant weight. The prints matched our boots exactly. But none of us had walked in that pattern. As I stared at the evidence in the sand, Williams appeared beside me, his notebook clutched against his chest. "They're learning," he whispered. "The petroglyphs describe this. First they copy your tracks, then your voice, then..." He swallowed hard. "Then they copy you." Far above us, something howled in the darkness, a sound that might have been whined through rock formations, or might have been something else entirely. Something that was learning to sound human. I looked back at our camp, at the figures huddled around the failing fire, and wondered if I was looking at my companions or at something else entirely, something that was wearing their faces while learning to become them. The real test, I realized with growing horror, would come in the morning if any of us lived to see it. ## Chapter 3, The Taking. I didn't sleep that night. None of us did, though Peterson claimed he had when morning finally came. We sat around the dying embers of our fire, listening to sounds that had no business existing in an empty canyon. Footsteps that circled our camp with mechanical precision. Voices that called our names from the darkness, perfect mimicry of conversations we had earlier that day. When Williams whispered, "Miguel, is that you?" around midnight, I looked across the fire to see him staring past me into the shadows. I followed his gaze and saw a figure standing at the edge of our firelight, tall, wearing the same clothes I was wearing, with my face looking back at us with an expression of mild curiosity. "Don't move," I breathed, but the figure had already melted back into the darkness. "Did you see it?" Williams asked, his voice barely audible. I nodded, unable to speak. Whatever was out there wasn't just copying our footprints anymore. It was copying us. Dawn came like a blessing, painting the canyon walls in shades of golden red that should have been beautiful but instead felt ominous. The normal sounds of morning, birdsong, insects, the distant call of a hawk were completely absent. The silence was so complete it made our ears ring. Peterson emerged from his tent looking haggard, dark circles under his eyes betraying his claim of having slept well. "Equipment check," he announced with forced authority. "We need to make sure everything's secure before we move out." But as we inventoried our gear, we discovered the first sign that our long night had been more than just imagination and nerves. Our equipment had been rearranged while we slept, not scattered or damaged, but carefully reorganized into patterns that none of us recognized. Circles and lines drawn in the sand around our packs, symbols that Williams identified with growing alarm. "These are from the petroglyphs," he said, consulting his notebook. "Warning markers. Boundary symbols." "Boundaries for what?" Dr. Foster demanded. "Between the living and the other." Peterson scoffed, but his heart wasn't in it anymore. Wind could have blown this stuff around. Maybe we didn't secure it properly. I studied the patterns in the sand. The symbols were too precise, too deliberate to have been created by wind. Someone or something had spent considerable time arranging our equipment while we sat 5 feet away around the fire. "We're leaving," I announced. "Right now." "We're packing up and heading back to the vehicles." "Absolutely not," Dr. Foster protested. "We have 4 more days of research planned. Yesterday's discoveries alone justify the entire expedition. Yesterday's discoveries are the reason we need to leave." I was already rolling up my sleeping bag, stuffing it into my pack with urgent efficiency. Those petroglyphs aren't just historical records, they're warnings. And we're not heeding them. Professor Harrington had been unusually quiet during the morning equipment check, standing apart from the group and staring up at the canyon walls with an expression I couldn't read. Now he approached me, his voice low and urgent. "Miguel, I need to tell you something. This isn't my first time in a place like this." I stopped packing and looked at him. "What do you mean?" "I've been studying sites like this for 20 years. Places where the locals claim strange things happen, where archaeological evidence suggests ritualistic activity." He paused, glancing toward Dr. Foster to make sure she wasn't listening. "I've seen things. Things that made me swear I'd never enter another restricted site." "Then why are you here?" His face was grim. "Because Dr. Foster threatened to ruin my career if I didn't participate. She knew I had experience with unusual sights. She needed someone who wouldn't be completely unprepared for what we might encounter." A chill ran down my spine. She knew? She knew this place was dangerous and brought us here anyway? She's not just documenting petroglyphs, Miguel. She's looking for something specific. Something the university would never officially sanction. Before I could ask him what, a shout from the far side of camp interrupted us. Anthony Williams was standing at the edge of our site, pointing toward a section of canyon wall where the morning light revealed something that made my blood run cold. There was a figure carved into the rock face, a human silhouette that hadn't been there the day before. It appeared to be walking, 1 foot raised as if caught in its stride. But as we watched, the figure seemed to shift and change, as if it were moving across the stone surface. "That's impossible," Peterson muttered, but his voice lacked conviction. Williams was frantically consulting his notebook, cross-referencing symbols and translations. "It's not a carving," he said, his voice shaking. "It's a record. A mark left by something that passed through here." "Passed through from where?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "From somewhere else. Somewhere that isn't here." Dr. Foster was already moving toward the wall with her camera, but I grabbed her arm. "Don't get close to it." "It's just a rock formation," she insisted, but I could hear the doubt in her voice. As we watched, the figure on the wall continued to move, its shadow shifting position even though the sun hadn't moved. And slowly, horribly, it began to take on features, a face that looked disturbingly familiar. It looked like Peterson. We were debating our next move when Peterson disappeared. It happened while we were packing up camp, each of us focused on our own equipment. One moment he was stuffing his sleeping bag into his pack 20 feet away, and the next moment he was gone. His gear was still there, arranged neatly beside a large boulder, but Peterson himself had vanished. "Kyle?" Dr. Foster called. "Kyle, where are you?" No answer. We spread out to search the immediate area, calling his name and checking behind rocks and into the narrow passages that branched off from our campsite. The canyon walls threw our voices back to us distorted, and sometimes the echoes sounded like responses, like Peterson calling back to us from the depths of the maze. "This is impossible," Dr. Foster muttered as we regrouped after 30 minutes of fruitless searching. "People don't just disappear." But Williams was studying his notebook again, his face pale. "According to the petroglyphs, they do. People who enter the sacred spaces without permission, they get taken. Absorbed. Replaced. Replaced by what?" Before Williams could answer, we heard Peterson's voice calling from somewhere deeper in the canyon. "Hey! Over here! I found something." We followed the sound through a narrow passage that opened into a circular chamber similar to the one we'd explored the day before. Peterson was standing in the center of the space, his back to us, examining what appeared to be another collection of petroglyphs. "Kyle, what are you doing?" Dr. Foster demanded. "We've been looking for you." He didn't turn around. "Look at these carvings. They're incredible. They tell the whole story." Something in his voice made me stop walking. It sounded like Peterson, but there was something wrong with the cadence, as if someone was trying to reproduce speech patterns they didn't quite understand. "Peterson," I called. "Turn around." He did, slowly, and my heart nearly stopped. It was Peterson's face, but it wasn't quite right. The features were correct, same nose, same jawline, same color eyes, but they were arranged with subtle wrongness, as if someone had reconstructed them from memory rather than genetics. The expression was completely blank, devoid of any personality or recognition. "What's wrong?" the Peterson thing asked, and its voice was perfectly Peterson's voice, but spoken without any emotion behind it. Williams grabbed my arm, his notebook falling to the ground. "That's not him," he whispered. "Look at his eyes." The eyes were the giveaway. Peterson's eyes had been dark brown, but these were lighter, almost gray, and they reflected light in a way that human eyes shouldn't. More importantly, they showed no recognition when they looked at us, no familiarity or personality, just empty observation, like a camera recording our movements. "Where's Peterson?" I demanded, my hand moving instinctively toward the knife on my belt. "I'm Peterson," the thing replied with perfect innocence. But it didn't move like Peterson, didn't carry itself with his swagger and confidence. It stood too still, breathed too regularly, and when it spoke, its mouth movements didn't quite sync with the words. Professor Harrington had backed toward the chamber entrance. "Miguel, we need to leave. Now!" But Dr. Foster was still staring at the Peterson thing with scientific fascination rather than horror. "This is extraordinary. Some kind of psychological manifestation, perhaps induced by environmental factors." "It's not psychological," Williams said, picking up his notebook from where he'd dropped it. "It's exactly what the petroglyphs describe. Something that takes people and learns to wear their faces." The Peterson thing tilted its head at an unnatural angle, as if listening to something we couldn't hear. "Where are you going?" it asked as we began to back toward the exit. "Don't you want to see what I found?" I grabbed Dr. Foster's arm and pulled her toward the passage. "We're leaving. Right now. But the research can go to hell." As we fled through the narrow passage, I could hear the Peterson thing calling after us in Peterson's voice. "Wait. Come back. You need to see this. You need to understand." But underneath Peterson's words, I heard something else, a sound that might have been laughter, but wasn't quite human. We didn't stop running until we reached the main canyon corridor, our packs bouncing against our backs and our breathing ragged in the thin air. Only when we were in open space with good visibility in all directions did I feel safe enough to stop and think. What happened to the real Peterson? Professor Harrington asked, his face flushed from exertion. Williams was consulting his notebook again, his hands shaking as he turned the pages. "According to this, the original is consumed. Used as raw material for the copy." "That's insane," Dr. Foster protested, but her voice lacked conviction. "Is it? Think about what we've seen. The footprints that matched ours before we made them. The figure in the photographs. The equipment arranged in patterns while we slept." Williams looked up from his notebook, his eyes wide with fear. "It's been studying us. learning to mimic us. And now it's taken one of us to perfect the process. A sound echoed from the direction we come, Peterson's voice, calling our names. But the sound was too distant, too distorted by the canyon walls, and there was something wrong with the way it repeated our names in exact sequence, like a recording being played back. We need to get out of this canyon system, I said. Now. Today. I agree, Professor Harrington said immediately. But Dr. Foster was shaking her head. We can't leave without completing the documentation. This could be the most important archaeological discovery of the century. It could also get us killed. By what? Environmental hallucinations? Mass hysteria? There has to be a scientific explanation for all of this. Williams closed his notebook with a snap. The scientific explanation is that some places should be left alone. That some boundaries exist for good reasons. As if summoned by his words, Peterson's voice echoed through the canyon again, closer this time. Where did you go? I found something amazing. You have to see this. But the voice was coming from 3 different directions at once, as if multiple Peterson things were calling to us from various positions throughout the canyon system. We're being hunted, I realized with growing horror. It's not just copying Peterson, it's making multiple copies. The voices called again, and this time they weren't just Peterson's. I heard my own voice calling from the southern passage. The way out is this way. Follow me. From the east came Dr. Foster's voice. I found the exit. Come quickly. And from the north, William's voice, high with panic, help. Something's wrong. I need help. We stood in the center of the corridor, surrounded by our own voices calling to us from every direction, and I realized that whatever was hunting us had learned enough to set traps using our own identities as bait. Stay together, I ordered. Don't trust anything you hear. Don't follow any voices, even if they sound like us. But even as I spoke, I wondered if the person giving that order was really me, or if the thing in the canyon had learned to wear my face as well. In the distance, something that sounded like Peterson laughed, and the sound echoed off the canyon walls until it became a chorus of laughter that seemed to come from everywhere at once. We huddled together in what had once been our secure camp, but now felt like a trap waiting to spring. Our backs were to a solid rock wall, giving us a clear view of the approaches, but I knew it wouldn't matter. Whatever was hunting us didn't need to sneak up on us, it had already gotten inside our heads. The voices had been calling to us for hours, a chorus of our own identities trying to lure us into the maze of side passages. Sometimes they sounded distressed, crying for help from the darkness. Other times they were cajoling, promising safety or discovery just around the next bend. But always, they were wrong in some subtle way, the cadence slightly off, the emotion not quite matching the words. Williams had stopped talking entirely after we heard his voice calling to us from a passage where he definitely wasn't. He sat with his back pressed against the canyon wall, clutching his notebook like a talisman, his eyes darting between the shadows as if expecting something to emerge at any moment. Dr. Foster maintained her scientific detachment, but I could see cracks forming in her composure. She kept reviewing the photographs on her camera, studying the images of the mysterious figure in the shadows, trying to find rational explanations for the impossible. Professor Harrington had been silent for the past hour, staring at the canyon walls with an expression that suggested he'd seen this before and knew how it ended. James, I said quietly. Those other sites you mentioned. What happened to the research teams? He looked at me with haunted eyes. They disappeared. All of them. Search and rescue would find their campsites intact, equipment neatly arranged, but no people. He paused, his voice dropping to a whisper. Sometimes they find 1 or 2 team members wandering out of the wilderness days later, claiming they'd gotten separated from the group. But they were different. Wrong in ways that were hard to define. Different how? They'd forgotten things they should have remembered. Personal details, shared experiences, the names of family members. But they remembered technical information perfectly, geological data, archaeological procedures, university protocols. He met my eyes. As if someone had copied their professional knowledge but missed the human details that make us who we are. A chill ran down my spine. What happened to them? They integrated back into society for a while. Returned to their jobs, their families. But eventually, people noticed the discrepancies. The missing emotional connections, the mechanical responses to personal situations. His voice became barely audible. They weren't the same people who had entered the restricted sites. Williams suddenly looked up from his notebook, his face pale. "They're coming." I listened carefully but heard only the normal sounds of wind through rock formations. "I don't hear anything." "Not sounds," Williams said, pointing to his notebook. "Vibrations." The petroglyphs describe how the entities move through stone itself, traveling through the canyon walls like water. As if summoned by his words, a subtle tremor ran through the ground beneath us. Not an earthquake, something more localized, more purposeful. Like something large moving through the solid rock around us. The tremor came again, closer this time, and I felt it through the soles of my boots. Then another, and another, until I realized we were feeling footsteps, massive, heavy footsteps moving through the earth itself. "It's under us," Dr. Foster whispered, finally understanding the magnitude of what we were facing. The vibrations stopped. In the sudden silence, I heard something that made my blood freeze, breathing. Slow, deliberate breathing that seemed to come from the rock wall itself, as if something enormous was inhaling and exhaling just on the other side of the stone. Then the wall began to change. It started as a subtle distortion, like heat haze rising from hot asphalt. But gradually, the solid rock became fluid, rippling like water disturbed by something moving beneath the surface. And slowly, impossibly, a hand emerged from the stone, human-sized but wrong in proportion, with fingers that were too long and joints that bent in directions they shouldn't. The hand was followed by an arm, then a shoulder, and finally a head that broke through the canyon wall like someone surfacing from deep water. The face that emerged was Peterson's face, but perfected in some horrible way, all the features correct but assembled with inhuman precision, like a sculpture carved by someone who understood anatomy but had never actually seen a living person. "Found you," it said in Peterson's voice, and smiled with too many teeth. We ran. There was no discussion, no debate about scientific documentation or research protocols. We grabbed our essential gear and fled into the maze of canyon passages, our footsteps echoing off the walls as the Peterson thing emerged fully from the stone behind us. "This way," Professor Harrington shouted, leading us down a passage that angled sharply upward toward what I hoped was daylight. But as we climbed, I realized we weren't alone in the passage. Our own voices echoed ahead of us, calling back encouragement, "Keep going." "Almost there." "You're safe now." The voices were coming from the direction we were heading. "Stop," I called, grabbing Harrington's arm. "It's hurting us." Driving us towards something. Behind us, the Peterson thing was following with unhurried confidence, its footsteps ringing against stone with mechanical precision. It wasn't chasing us, it was guiding us, like a sheepdog moving livestock toward a slaughtering pen. The petroglyphs mentioned multiple entities, Williams gasped, consulting his notebook even as we ran. A whole colony of them, working together. We reached a junction where 3 passages converged, and I had to make a decision. The upward passage where our voices were calling continued toward the surface, but something about it felt wrong. The other 2 passages led deeper into the canyon system, into darkness that seemed to swallow our flashlight beams. From the dark passages came different sounds, Williams sobbing in apparent distress, Dr. Foster screaming for help. The voices were designed to trigger our protective instincts, to make us rush toward what sounded like our companions in danger. "None of those are us," I said firmly. "Everyone stay together. We're taking the middle passage." "That leads deeper into the canyon," Dr. Foster protested. "Exactly. It's the one they don't want us to take." We plunged into the middle passage, our flashlights cutting through darkness that seemed thicker than air. The walls pressed close on both sides, and I had to fight off waves of claustrophobia as the ceiling dropped lower with each step. Behind us, the Peterson thing had reached the junction. I heard it pause, then begin to laugh, Peterson's laugh, but sustained far longer than human lungs should have allowed, rising and falling in pitch like a broken record. "You can't hide from us," it called, and its voice echoed through all 3 passages simultaneously, as if it were somehow speaking from multiple locations. "We know you now." We've tasted your shapes, learned your patterns. There's nowhere in this canyon system we can't find you. The passage began to descend sharply, leading us deeper into the earth. The air grew cooler and carried strange currents that made our flashlight beams waver. And gradually, I became aware of new sounds echoing from ahead of us, not voices this time, but something worse. Breathing. Multiple sources of breathing, slow and synchronized, as if we were approaching something that was waiting for us. Williams grabbed my arm. "The ritual chamber," he whispered. "It's driving us back to the ritual chamber." I realized he was right. Despite our efforts to escape, we were being systematically herded back toward the chamber where this had all started. The entity or entities wanted us there for some reason. Why? I asked. What happens in the ritual chamber? Williams consulted his notebook with trembling hands. According to the petroglyphs, that's where the transformation is completed, where the copies become permanent. From ahead of us came a new sound that made my skin crawl, our own voices, but speaking in unison, reciting what sounded like an incantation in a language none of us recognized. The words echoed off the passage walls, growing louder as we approached their source. "We need to go back," Dr. Foster said, but when we turned around, the passage behind us was blocked. Where there had been open space, solid rock now stretched from floor to ceiling, as if the canyon itself was sealing off our escape routes. "Impossible," she breathed. "Nothing's impossible here," Williams replied. "This place exists according to different rules. Rules that were established long before humans set foot in this canyon." The chanting ahead of us grew louder, and I could make out individual voices now, our voices, speaking in perfect harmony. And underneath the chanting, another sound that made my stomach turn, wet, organic noises, like something being reshaped at a cellular level. The passage opened into the ritual chamber, and what we saw there would haunt me for the rest of my life. The chamber was filled with figures that looked like us, dozens of them, standing in concentric circles around the central altar. Some were obviously unfinished, their faces smooth and featureless like clay waiting to be molded. Others were nearly perfect copies, identical to us down to the smallest detail. And in the center of the chamber, something was taking shape, something that looked like Anthony Williams, but wasn't quite complete. Its face kept shifting, features flowing like wax, as if it were trying different combinations of eyes, nose, and mouth before settling on the final arrangement. The real Williams, our Williams, let out a strangled cry and collapsed to his knees. "They're making more of us," he whispered. "Building an army of copies." The figures in the chamber turned toward us in perfect unison, and I saw our own faces looking back at us with expressions of alien intelligence. They smiled, and began to walk toward us with movements that were almost human, but not quite. "Welcome," they said in our voices, speaking as one. "Now you can stay forever." I reached for the knife at my belt, but stopped as I realized the futility of it. How do you fight an enemy that looks exactly like you? How do you tell the difference between your real companions and perfect copies? The answer, I realized with growing horror, was that you couldn't. The circle of false companions was closing in, and behind them, I could see more shapes emerging from the chamber walls, Peterson things, Williams things, Foster things, even versions of myself that moved with predatory grace. We were surrounded by ourselves, and there was nowhere left to run. In the center of the ritual chamber, surrounded by dozens of our own faces, I made a decision that went against every instinct for self-preservation I possessed. Instead of running, instead of fighting, I stepped forward toward the altar where the Williams thing was still taking shape. "Miguel, what are you doing?" Dr. Foster hissed, but I ignored her. Williams, the real Williams, was still clutching his notebook, his translations of the petroglyphs. As the copies of ourselves closed in around us, he looked up at me with desperate understanding. "The binding ritual," he whispered. "It's all here. The original inhabitants of this canyon, they didn't just flee from these entities. They bound them, trapped them in the ritual chamber." The circle of false companions had stopped advancing, watching us with expressions of mild curiosity. They seemed confident in their victory, certain that we had no escape. But their confidence gave me hope. It meant they didn't understand what Williams had discovered. "How?" I asked, kneeling beside him. "Blood offering to the altar." Words of binding spoken in the old language. And he swallowed hard, consulting his notebook one final time. And a sacrifice. Someone has to remain behind to maintain the binding. The implications of that hit me like a physical blow. To trap these entities, to prevent them from spreading beyond the canyon, someone would have to stay. Someone would have to become a permanent guardian, keeping the ritual alive for as long as the binding held. No, Dr. Foster said, realizing what we were discussing. There has to be another way. But the Peterson thing from the chamber wall had joined the circle now, and when it spoke, its voice carried an authority that suggested it was more than just a copy, it was the primary entity, the source from which all the others flowed. There is no other way, it said with Peterson's mouth. You came here willingly. You ignored the warnings, violated the sacred spaces, disturbed things that should have remained buried. Now you will serve as raw material for our expansion. Professor Harrington had been silent throughout our desperate flight, but now he stepped forward with something like resignation in his eyes. I've seen this before, he said quietly. I know how it ends. He reached into his pack and pulled out a small, wrapped object I hadn't seen before. As he unwrapped it, I saw that it was a piece of pottery, ancient, covered in the same symbols we've been seeing on the canyon walls. James, Dr. Foster said, her voice sharp with realization. That's from a restricted site. You took that from the last expedition, he finished. 20 years ago. I was the only survivor, and I swore I'd never let this happen again. The false companions had begun to move again, closing the circle tighter. But Professor Harrington ignored them, focusing entirely on the ancient pottery in his hands. This is from their original binding, he explained. A fragment of the ritual that the ancient inhabitants used to trap these entities the first time. When the earthquake damaged the canyon, it broke the original binding. That's why these things are active again. Williams was frantically translating symbols from his notebook, cross-referencing them with the markings on Harrington's pottery. The words, he said urgently. I can piece together the words of binding. But someone needs to speak them while the blood offering is made. The circle of copies was almost close enough to touch us now. I could see the subtle wrongness in their movements, the way they breathed in perfect synchronization, the way their eyes reflected light like mirrors instead of absorbing it like human eyes should. I'll do it, I said, but Professor Harrington shook his head. It has to be me. I've been carrying this guilt for 20 years. 20 years of knowing I let something escape that should have stayed buried. He looked at each of us in turn. Get ready to run when the binding takes hold. It won't last forever. Eventually, someone will have to come back and renew it. But it should hold long enough for you to get out of the canyon and warn others. James, no, Dr. Foster protested, but he was already moving toward the altar. The false companions seemed to understand what was happening now, and their mild curiosity transformed into urgent action. They lunged forward, reaching for us with hands that were perfectly human in appearance but moved with inhuman speed and strength. I grabbed Williams and Dr. Foster, pulling them toward the chamber entrance as Professor Harrington reached the altar. The Peterson thing intercepted him, grabbing his arm with crushing force, but he managed to break the pottery against the stone surface of the altar. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The broken pottery released something, a sound, a vibration, a presence that had been trapped within the clay for centuries. The false companions stopped their advance as if they'd hit an invisible wall, their perfect features contorting with something that might have been pain or might have been recognition. The words. Harrington shouted. Williams, the words. Williams began to recite the binding incantation in the ancient language, his voice growing stronger with each syllable. As he spoke, I pulled out my knife and cut my palm, letting blood drip onto the altar stone. The blood sizzled when it hit the surface, releasing smoke that smelled of sage and copper and something indefinably old. The false companions began to scream, not with human voices, but with sounds that existed at frequencies that hurt to hear. Their perfect human facade started to dissolve, revealing the true forms underneath. What I saw in those moments would give me nightmares for the rest of my life, shapes that were only approximately human, beings that had learned to mimic our appearance but had never truly understood what it meant to be human. Go! Harrington shouted as the binding took hold. Get out of here. Tell them to seal this place permanently. The chamber began to shake, rocks falling from the ceiling as the ancient magic reasserted itself. The false companions were being drawn back toward the walls, their forms becoming translucent as they were pulled into the stone itself. We ran through the collapsing passage, our flashlights cutting through dust and debris as the canyon system rearranged itself around the renewed binding. Behind us, I could hear Professor Harrington still speaking the words of the ritual, his voice growing fainter as distance and stone separated us. We emerged from the canyon system 3 hours later, battered and exhausted but alive. The sun was setting, painting the desert sky in shades of orange and purple that seemed almost impossibly beautiful after the horror we'd experienced underground. Our vehicles were where we'd left them, untouched by whatever had been hunting us in the depths. As we loaded our gear with shaking hands, Dr. Foster kept looking back toward the canyon entrance with an expression I couldn't read. "We have to go back for him," she said finally. "No," I replied firmly. "We don't. Going back would undo everything he sacrificed to accomplish." Williams was already in the passenger seat of the truck, his notebook clutched against his chest. He hadn't spoken since we'd escaped the chamber, and I wasn't sure he ever would again. The experience had broken something in him, some fundamental trust in the safety and predictability of the world. As we drove away from Canyonlands, I caught sight of the canyon entrance in my side mirror. For just a moment, I thought I saw a figure standing at the mouth of the restricted section, tall, familiar, wearing Professor Harrington's clothes. But it was gone before I could be sure, and I didn't mention it to the others. The official report listed Professor Harrington as missing, presumed dead due to a climbing accident in unstable terrain. The earthquake damage made the story plausible, and no one questioned our account too closely. The restricted section was permanently sealed, with warnings posted about geological instability and structural hazards. Dr. Foster published her research, but the focus shifted to general southwestern archaeological patterns rather than the specific site we visited. She never spoke publicly about what we'd found in the ritual chamber, though I sometimes caught her staring at her photographs with an expression of longing that worried me. Williams never finished his dissertation. He dropped out of graduate school and moved back home with his parents, claiming he needed time to process what he'd experienced. I heard from mutual acquaintances that he'd become intensely religious, attending church services multiple times a week and speaking about the importance of respecting boundaries that shouldn't be crossed. As for myself, I returned to my work as a search and rescue specialist, but I was never quite the same. I developed an almost supernatural ability to sense when wilderness areas felt wrong, when they carried the kind of presence that meant danger for anyone who entered unprepared. I guided search teams away from those places when I could, and when I couldn't, I made sure they understood the importance of respecting the land and heeding local warnings. I've been a park ranger for 9 years now, and I finally understand why the old maps mark certain areas as "Here be dragons." It wasn't superstition or folklore, it was a warning system, a way of marking places where the normal rules don't apply, where things exist that shouldn't, where boundaries between worlds grow thin. 5 years after our expedition, I returned to the canyon alone. Not to the restricted section that remained sealed, but to a neighboring area where I could observe the entrance from a distance. I brought offerings: sage, cornmeal, tobacco, things my grandfather had taught me were appropriate for sacred places. As I performed the small ceremony he'd shown me as a child, I thought I heard something carried on the wind from the direction of the sealed canyon. It might have been Professor Harrington's voice, speaking words in the old language, maintaining the binding that kept something terrible from spreading into the world. Or it might have been just the wind. I prefer to think it was Professor Harrington, still standing guard in a place where someone needs to stand guard, still speaking the words that keep the rest of us safe. It's a comforting thought, and in my line of work, I've learned to take comfort where I can find it. The desert keeps its secrets, but sometimes it shares its warnings with those wise enough to listen. The old maps were right, here be dragons. And sometimes, just sometimes, there are people brave enough to make sure the dragons stay where they belong. I placed my offering on a flat rock and turned to leave, but not before whispering a prayer of thanks to whatever forces keep the boundaries intact. As I walked back to my truck, I didn't look over my shoulder. Some things are better left unseen, and some sounds are better left unheard. The desert stretched out around me, beautiful and terrible and eternal, hiding its secrets beneath a sky full of stars. And somewhere in the sealed canyons behind me, the binding held, maintained by sacrifice and sustained by the kind of courage that most people will never have to find within themselves. It's enough to know that it's there, standing between us and the darkness, speaking the old words that keep the ancient hungers at bay. For now, at least. For now. My name is Daniel, and what I'm about to tell you happened 3 months ago in the mountains of eastern Kentucky. I worked as a collections liaison for the Hartwell University Museum, which sounds more impressive than it actually was. Most days, I shuffle paperwork around my cramped office, coordinating artifact pickups and managing insurance claims for damaged pieces. The closest I usually got to adventure was arguing with delivery drivers about proper handling procedures. That Tuesday started differently. The autumn air carried the scent of decay and wood smoke as I loaded my van with transport cases and manila folders thick with documentation. The university's regular delivery team had botched the load manifest twice, somehow managing to lose 3 Civil War-era farming tools and misplace an entire crate of pottery shards. Dr. Caldwell, the museum director, was furious. His face had turned the color of old brick when he slammed the latest incident report on my desk. "Daniel, I need you to handle this personally," he'd said, his voice tight with controlled anger. "Drive out there, catalog everything, and bring it back yourself. I don't care if it takes 3 days." The destination was an abandoned mining survey station deep in the Appalachian Hills, about 4 hours from campus. According to the paperwork, it had been used as a temporary storage facility for artifacts excavated from various sites across the region. Budget cuts had shuttered the operation 5 years ago, leaving everything in a bureaucratic limbo. I'd made this kind of trip before, but never this far into the mountains. The first hour passed through familiar college towns and strip malls, but gradually the landscape changed. Rolling hills gave way to steep ridges covered in thick forest. The roads narrowed, and the asphalt developed cracks that spiderwebbed across the surface like old scars. By the third hour, I was following a Tulane County road that wound through valleys so deep the sun barely penetrated the canopy overhead. The shadows seemed too dark for midday, and I found myself turning on my headlights even though it wasn't quite evening yet. Every few miles, I passed the skeletal remains of some mining operation, rusted equipment, weathered buildings with collapsed roofs, and those terrible black holes in the mountainsides that seemed to swallow light. The GPS signal died somewhere near a bridge that looked like it hadn't been inspected since the 1970s. The wooden planks groaned under my van's weight, and I could see the creek 30 feet below through gaps in the boards. From there, I had to rely on handwritten directions that Dr. Caldwell had printed from some archive. Turn left at the abandoned gas station. Check. The station was a hollow shell with broken windows and gas pumps that looked like they'd been gutted for scrap metal. Continue 2.3 miles past the church. The church was a small white building with a steeple that leaned at an alarming angle. Its cemetery was overrun with weeds, and several headstones had toppled over. Look for the mining road on your right, marked by yellow paint on a dead oak. That yellow paint was so faded it looked more like a stain, and the oak tree was not just dead but partially hollowed out. Something had been living inside it. I could see scratch marks in the softwood and what looked like bones scattered around the base. The mining road was barely more than 2 tire ruts separated by a strip of dead grass. My van lurched and bounced over rocks and potholes that seemed designed to swallow vehicles whole. Tree branches scraped against the sides with sounds like fingernails on metal. After 20 minutes of this torture, I began to wonder if I'd made a wrong turn somewhere. Then I saw it. A concrete building squatting beneath a grove of twisted pine trees. It was bigger than I'd expected, maybe 50 feet long and 30 feet wide, but it looked like it was slowly being reclaimed by the forest. Vines had crept up the walls and were working their way under the corrugated metal roof. Several windows had been boarded up with plywood that had warped and split with age. I parked next to a pickup truck that I assumed belonged to Dr. Mantry, the field researcher who was supposed to meet me. The truck was ancient, maybe from the 1980s, and covered in a thick layer of mud and pine needles. When I touched the hood to see if the engine was still warm, my hand came away sticky with some kind of sap or resin. Dr. Mantry emerged from the building before I could knock. He was shorter than I'd expected, probably in his early 60s, with a salt and pepper beard that needed trimming and keen blue-gray eyes that seemed to take in everything at once. His clothes looked like they'd seen better decades, a faded windbreaker over a flannel shirt with patches, and work boots that were more duct tape than leather. "You must be Daniel," he said, extending a hand that felt like worn leather. "Sorry about the location. This place isn't exactly on the tourist maps." "No problem," I lied, rubbing a crick out of my neck from the drive. "How long have you been working out here?" "On and off for about 15 years, he said, leading me toward the building. "Used to be a proper research station back in the day. We'd use it as a base camp for archaeological surveys throughout the region. Budget cuts, you know how it goes." The building's entrance was secured with a heavy padlock that looked newer than anything else on the property. Dr. Mandry produced a key ring that was more rust than metal and worked the lock open with practiced efficiency. "Fair warning," he said as the door swung open with a groan, "the generator's a bit temperamental, and we're not exactly connected to the power grid out here. Also, some of the specimens are, well, you'll see." The smell hit me first, a mixture of damp concrete, old wood, and something else I couldn't quite identify. Something organic and unpleasant, like meat that had been left out too long. The interior was larger than it appeared from outside, with a concrete floor that showed water stains along the walls and metal shelving units that stretched up to the ceiling. A single fluorescent light hung from the rafters, connected to a generator that hummed and sputtered in the corner. Dr. Mandry flipped a switch, and the light flickered to life, casting harsh shadows that seemed to move even when nothing else was moving. "Home sweet home," he said with a grin that didn't quite reach his eyes. "Let's get started." The shelving units were packed with wooden crates in various states of decay. Some were pristine, obviously recent additions to the collection, while others showed signs of age and moisture damage. A few had corners that had rotted away completely, revealing glimpses of their contents, rusted metal objects, fragments of pottery, and what looked like bundles of old fabric. Dr. Mandry handed me a clipboard with the manifest attached. "Everything's organized by excavation site and date," he explained. "Most of this stuff came from homesteads and work camps throughout the mountains. Some of it's interesting from a historical perspective, but a lot of it is just debris." I started with the newer crates, checking each item against the manifest and making notes about condition and transportation requirements. Most of the artifacts were exactly what I'd expected: farming tools, household items, fragments of pottery and glassware. The kind of things you'd find in any rural archaeological dig. Dr. Mandry narrated as I worked, telling stories about the excavations and the people who'd once lived in these remote mountains. He had a way of bringing the artifacts to life, describing not just what they were but how they'd been used, who might have owned them, and what their presence revealed about daily life in early Appalachian settlements. "That washboard there," he said, pointing to a corroded metal object, "came from a cabin foundation up on Devil's Ridge. Found it next to what was left of a stone fireplace. Probably belonged to a woman named Sarah, according to local records. She raised 5 children in a 2-room cabin with no running water and no electricity. The work was tedious but not unpleasant." Dr. Mandry's stories helped pass the time, and the generator's steady humming provided a kind of white noise that made the isolation feel less oppressive. Outside, the wind had picked up, causing the trees to sway and cast moving shadows through the small windows. It was during the 3rd hour that I noticed something odd about the arrangement of the crates. Most were organized in neat rows with clear labels indicating their origin and contents. But in the back corner, beneath a leaning shelf unit that looked like it might collapse at any moment, I spotted something that didn't fit the pattern. It was a crate, but not like the others. Where the rest were made of wood with metal hardware, this one was constructed entirely of metal, a dull gray that seemed to absorb the fluorescent light rather than reflect it. It had heavy hinge clamps around all 4 sides and a dented corner that suggested it had been dropped or struck with considerable force. Most notably, it had no visible lid or opening seam, as if it had been welded shut. "Dr. Mandry," I called, setting down my clipboard. "What's this one back here?" I heard his pen stop scratching against paper. The silence stretched for several seconds before he responded. "Which one?" "The metal crate. It's not on the manifest." When I turned around, Dr. Mandry was standing perfectly still, his face drained of color. The easy warmth that had characterized his voice all afternoon was gone, replaced by something flat and careful. That one. His voice was barely above a whisper. I was hoping we wouldn't have to deal with that one. I looked back at the crate, noticing details I'd missed before. The metal surface wasn't just dull, it was covered in a fine patina of what looked like rust, except the color was wrong. Instead of the orange-brown of iron oxide, this was darker, almost black, with an oily sheen that seemed to shift in the changing light. "What's in it?" I asked. Dr. Mantry set down his paperwork and walked over to where I was standing. Up close, I could see that his hands were shaking slightly. "We're not entirely sure," he said. "It was excavated near South Ridge in 2009. Initially, we thought it was industrial debris, maybe something left over from the mining operations. But then we realized how deep it had been buried." "How deep?" "Too deep. 15 feet down, wrapped in what looked like animal hide. Elk hide, maybe, but darker than anything I'd ever seen. And it had been treated with something, some kind of resin or pitch that preserved it perfectly. The hide was stitched with what looked like sinew, and the whole thing was buried in a layer of stones arranged in a very specific pattern." I knelt down to examine the crate more closely. The metal was cold to the touch, significantly colder than the ambient temperature in the building. When I ran my fingers along the surface, they came away with a thin film of something that felt oily but looked clear. "Have you opened it?" I asked. Dr. Mantry was quiet for so long that I looked up to see if he'd heard me. His blue-gray eyes were fixed on the crate with an expression I couldn't quite read, part fear, part fascination, part something else entirely. "We tried," he said finally. "Back in 2009, when we first brought it here. The clamps were locked somehow, not with any kind of mechanism we could understand, but they wouldn't budge. We tried everything, crowbars, bolt cutters, even brought in a welder to try to cut through the metal. Nothing worked. And now," he pointed to the clamps. "Take a look." I examined them more closely and saw what he meant. The clamps were no longer secured. In fact, one of them was hanging open, as if it had simply released on its own. Beneath it, a thin black substance had seeped out and dried on the concrete floor. "When did this happen?" I asked, though I wasn't sure I wanted to know the answer. "We noticed it about 6 months ago," Dr. Mantry said. "Right around the time we started hearing the sounds." "What sounds?" Instead of answering directly, he walked over to the generator and adjusted something that made the humming change pitch slightly. "At night, mostly. Sometimes during the day if we stayed late. Scratching sounds, like something trying to get out. Or maybe trying to get in. We'd search the building, check all the walls and the roof, but we never found the source. The fluorescent light flickered, casting us into brief darkness before sputtering back to life. In that moment of darkness, I could have sworn I heard something, a soft scraping sound, like fingernails on metal." "Dr. Mantry," I said slowly, "maybe we should focus on the other items for now. Get them loaded and deal with this, whatever this is, separately." He nodded, but I could see the relief in his face. "That's probably a good idea. Most of the valuable items are in the front section anyway. We can come back for the rest tomorrow if needed." But even as we returned to cataloging the other artifacts, I found my attention drawn back to that metal crate. The black substance beneath the open clamp seemed to glisten in the changing light, and I could have sworn it was slowly spreading across the concrete floor. Outside, the wind was picking up, and the trees were making sounds like whispered conversations. The generator continued its uneven humming, occasionally skipping a beat in a way that made the light flicker and the shadows dance. By late afternoon, we'd cataloged about half of the collection. The plan was to load everything into my van at first light and make the drive back to the university. Dr. Mantry said he wanted to walk down to an old stream bed where previous research teams had camped to check on some equipment they'd left behind. "I'll be back in 20 minutes, he said, pulling on his windbreaker. "Just finish up the paperwork and get everything ready for transport tomorrow." I nodded and watched him disappear down a trail that led into the thickening shadows of the forest. The silence that followed his departure was different from the comfortable quiet we'd shared while working. This was heavy and expectant, as if the building itself was holding its breath. I tried to focus on the manifest, triple-checking insurance details and making notes about items that would require special handling. But the scratching sound had returned, faint but persistent, and it seemed to be coming from the direction of that metal crate. When I finally worked up the courage to look, I saw that another clamp had opened. 20 minutes stretched into 30, then 40. I called Dr. Mandry's name, my voice echoing through the concrete building and fading into nothing. The generator chose that moment to skip another beat, plunging me into darkness for several seconds before the fluorescent light flickered back to life. Outside, the shadows had deepened considerably. What had been a forest in late afternoon was now a wall of black shapes that seemed to shift and move even when the wind was still. I checked my watch, 5:47 p.m. Not quite sunset, but the heavy canopy overhead made it feel like twilight. I gave him 5 more minutes, then grabbed my flashlight and headed for the door. The trail he'd taken was obvious enough, a worn path that led away from the building and curved around a stand of pine trees before disappearing into the underbrush. I'd walked maybe 50 yards when I realized I could no longer see the building behind me. The forest was different at dusk. During our arrival, the trees had seemed merely dense. Now they felt oppressive, leaning in from all sides like curious giants. My flashlight beam seemed pathetically weak against the gathering darkness, creating a small circle of visibility that only emphasized how much I couldn't see. The trail forked after about a quarter mile. The left path showed signs of recent use, broken twigs, disturbed leaves, a clear line of passage through the undergrowth. The right path led uphill into thicker forest, dark enough that my flashlight couldn't penetrate more than a few feet. I took the left path, following what I assumed were Dr. Mandry's footprints. The ground was soft from recent rain, and I could see the clear imprint of work boots heading toward what sounded like running water. The stream bed couldn't be far. That's when I found his boot. It was sitting upright in the middle of the trail, laces still tied, positioned as if someone had simply stepped out of it and continued walking barefoot. The leather was scuffed and worn, definitely the boot Dr. Mandry had been wearing. But there was something else, something that made my stomach clench with sudden fear. The inside of the boot was wet. Not with water, but with something darker, something that gleamed wetly in my flashlight beam and gave off a metallic smell that reminded me of old pennies. I called his name again, louder this time, my voice cracking slightly. The forest swallowed the sound completely, offering nothing in return but the whisper of wind through leaves and the distant sound of running water. That's when I heard the movement above me. It started as a rustling in the canopy overhead, heavy, deliberate, definitely not the wind. Something large was moving through the trees, traveling from branch to branch with a rhythm that was almost human but not quite right. The sound of feet or hands gripping bark, followed by the creak of branches bending under weight, then the whispered thud of something landing on another perch. I swept my flashlight upward, but the beam couldn't penetrate the thick canopy. Whatever was up there stayed just beyond the edge of the light, following me as I stood frozen in the middle of the trail. The movement stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound had been. I could feel something watching me from the darkness above, could sense its attention like a physical weight pressing down on my shoulders. My heart was hammering so hard I was sure the sound would give away my location. Then I heard breathing. Not the quick, shallow gasps of fear that were coming from my own lungs, but something slow and deliberate. Each breath was drawn out, almost contemplative, as if whatever was producing the sound was savoring the moment. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I turned and ran back toward the building, my flashlight beam bouncing wildly as I stumbled over roots and rocks. Behind me, the movement in the trees resumed, but now it was faster, more urgent. Whatever had been watching me was now pursuing me, crashing through branches with less care for stealth. I burst out of the tree line and saw the building ahead, its fluorescent light spilling through the small windows like a beacon. But something was wrong. The door I'd carefully locked was standing wide open, and the light inside was flickering chaotically, as if the generator was struggling to maintain power. I paused at the threshold, breathing hard and listening for any sound from inside. The generator was running, but with an odd stutter that I hadn't noticed before. The scratching sound had returned too, louder now and more insistent. When I stepped inside, I immediately saw that the metal crate had been moved. It was no longer tucked beneath the leaning shelf unit. Someone or something had dragged it out into the open area near the center of the building. All 4 clamps were now open, hanging loose like broken fingers. The black substance that had been seeping from beneath the first clamp had spread across the concrete floor in a pattern that looked disturbingly organic, like veins or root systems. And the crate itself was no longer sealed. The lid, which I hadn't even been able to see before, was now slightly ajar, revealing a darkness inside that seemed deeper than the metal wall should have allowed. No light from the fluorescent tube above seemed to penetrate that opening, as if the interior absorbed illumination rather than reflecting it. The scratching sound was coming from inside the crate. It was rhythmic and deliberate, like fingernails dragging across metal, but there was something underneath it, a wet, sliding sound that made my skin crawl. Whatever was making the noise was definitely organic, definitely alive, and definitely trying to get out. I backed toward the door, keeping my eyes on the crate. The scratching paused, as if whatever was inside had sensed my presence. In the sudden silence, I could hear my own heartbeat and the labored wheezing of the generator. Then I heard something else, breathing. The same slow, deliberate breathing I'd heard in the forest, but now it was coming from somewhere behind the shelving units. Long, drawn-out inhalations followed by equally long exhalations, as if something large was savoring each breath. I continued backing toward the door, moving as quietly as possible. My hand was almost on the doorframe when I heard the dragging sound. It started behind the shelves, somewhere in the darkness between the storage units and the back wall. A heavy, wet sliding sound, like something being pulled across concrete. But this wasn't the sound of an object being moved, this was the sound of something moving itself, something that didn't have proper legs or feet, something that had to drag its bulk across the floor. The breathing grew louder, closer. Whatever was back there was making its way toward the front of the building, using the narrow spaces between the shelving units. I could hear boxes being knocked aside, the scrape of wood on concrete, the occasional metallic clang as something heavy struck the shelving frames. I reached the doorway and took one last look back at the building. In the chaotic flickering of the fluorescent light, I caught a glimpse of movement in the space between 2 tall shelving units. Something pale and wet was flowing through the gap like thick liquid, but it moved with purpose and intelligence. I didn't want to see what it looked like in full light. I turned and ran for my van, not caring about the noise I was making or what might hear me. My keys were in my pocket, and I had them out and ready before I reached the driver's door. The engine started on the first try, a small miracle considering the events of the day, and I was backing down the rutted mining road before I'd even fully closed the door. At the last curve before the main road, I made the mistake of looking back. They were standing at the tree line, just at the edge of where my headlights could reach. 3 figures, tall and impossibly thin, their skin the color of old bones in the darkness. Their limbs were too long for their bodies, hanging at their sides like broken branches. But it was their faces that made me floor the accelerator. They weren't quite human faces. The proportions were wrong, eyes set too wide apart, mouths that stretched too far across their skulls. And they were all looking directly at me with expressions that might have been curiosity or hunger. It was impossible to tell which. One of them raised what might have been an arm and something that might have been a wave. I drove through the night without stopping, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly that my knuckles went white. The van's radio crackled to life somewhere around midnight, filling the cab with static and something that sounded like voices speaking in a language I didn't recognize. The words, if they were words, had a wet, sliding quality that reminded me of the sounds I'd heard behind the shelving units. I turned the radio off, but it turned itself back on twice before I finally pulled the fuse. I reached the university at 6:12 a.m., my eyes burning from lack of sleep and my hands still shaking from adrenaline that refused to dissipate. The campus was quiet, just a few early joggers and maintenance workers starting their day. The normalcy of it felt surreal after what I'd experienced in the mountains. I sat in the parking lot for 20 minutes, trying to compose myself enough to write a coherent report. But every time I tried to put the events into words, they sounded either insane or inadequate. How do you explain to your supervisor that you abandoned a collection worth thousands of dollars because you saw something that might not have been human watching you from the trees? In the end, I kept it simple, site incomplete. Retrieval aborted due to safety concerns. Recommend postponing collection until site can be properly secured. Dr. Caldwell wasn't in his office yet, so I left a report on his desk along with my keys and ID card. Then I went home, showered off the smell of that place, and tried to sleep. But every time I closed my eyes, I saw those three figures standing at the tree line, their two long arms hanging at their sides, their faces turned toward me with that expression of terrible interest. I managed a few hours of fitful rest before the phone woke me. Dr. Caldwell's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Daniel, I need you to explain this report. What exactly happened up there?" I gave him a heavily edited version of events. Equipment failure, dangerous conditions, Dr. Mandry's disappearance. I emphasized the isolation and the difficulty of getting emergency services to the site if something went wrong. I did not mention the crate or the figures in the trees or the sounds in the darkness. "Well, where's Dr. Mandry now?" Dr. Caldwell demanded. "Have you tried contacting him?" I hadn't, actually. In my rush to get away from that place, I'd completely forgotten about trying to find him through normal channels. Dr. Caldwell gave me his phone number and address, and I spent the next hour making calls that went nowhere. Dr. Mandry's phone went straight to voicemail. His address was a post office box in a town I'd never heard of. The local sheriff's department said they'd send someone to check the site, but they seemed skeptical about the urgency. That afternoon, Dr. Caldwell called me back. "The sheriff's deputy went out to the site," he said. "Building's empty. No sign of Dr. Mandry or any kind of disturbance. He thinks maybe the man just finished his work and left." "What about the artifacts?" "Still there, apparently. Everything's secured and ready for transport, just like you arranged. The deputy offered to escort our regular delivery team out there tomorrow if we want to complete the pickup." I felt a cold knot forming in my stomach. "Dr. Caldwell, I don't think that's a good idea. There was something wrong with that place. Something dangerous. Daniel." His voice took on the patient tone he used when explaining things to difficult donors. "I understand you had a stressful experience. Remote locations can be unsettling, especially when you're there alone. But we have a professional obligation to complete this collection. The artifacts represent significant historical value, and we can't simply abandon them because of atmospheric concerns." That night, I tried calling the sheriff's department myself, hoping to get more details about what the deputy had actually seen. The dispatcher put me through to Deputy Carl, who had made the drive out to the site. "Yeah, I checked the place out," he said. "Looked fine to me. Door was locked, generator was running, everything seemed normal. A lot of old boxes and things inside, like you'd expect from a storage facility." "What about the metal crate? The one without any labels?" There was a pause. "Metal crate? I didn't see anything like that. Just wooden boxes, mostly. Some pretty old by the look of them. It was in the back corner, underneath a shelf unit. Gray metal, about 3 feet long, with heavy clamps around the edges." Another pause, longer this time. "Son, I've walked through that whole building. There wasn't anything like what you're describing." After I hung up, I sat in my apartment trying to make sense of what Carl had told me. Either he'd missed the crate somehow, or it had been moved, or something else was happening that I didn't understand. I made a decision that probably saved my life. I resigned. I drafted a simple letter citing personal reasons and submitted it through email. Then I started making phone calls to friends in other cities, looking for job opportunities that would take me as far from eastern Kentucky as possible. I found a position with a museum in Oregon and accepted it before the background check was complete. But the story didn't end there. 2 weeks later, Dr. Caldwell called me at my new apartment in Portland. His voice was different, shaky, uncertain, nothing like the authoritative tone he'd used during our previous conversations. "Daniel, I need to ask you some questions about the site in Kentucky. About what you really saw out there." "Why? What happened?" "We sent a team out there. James and Robert from our regular delivery crew, plus 2 graduate students, Michael and William. They were supposed to do a quick pickup, just load everything and drive back." I felt that familiar cold knot forming in my stomach again. "And they never came back. We found their van 3 days later, parked on the side of the road about 10 miles from the site. Engine still running, doors open, all their personal belongings still inside. But no sign of the team members. The room felt like it was tilting around me. Have you contacted the police? Of course. They've organized search teams, brought in dogs, even used helicopters to scan the forest. Nothing. It's like they just vanished. Dr. Caldwell was quiet for a moment. When he spoke again, his voice was barely above a whisper. Daniel, the search teams found something else. The building where the artifacts were stored. It's gone. Gone? Not destroyed. Not burned down or collapsed. Just gone. There's nothing there but an empty clearing and some concrete foundations that look like they've been weathered by decades of exposure. Like the building was never there at all. I hung up the phone and walked out onto my apartment balcony, needing fresh air and the sight of normal city life below. But even surrounded by traffic and people and the mundane reality of urban existence, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was still watching me. That night, I dreamed about the metal crate. In the dream, it was sitting in my new apartment, positioned in the center of my living room with all 4 clamps hanging open. The black substance was spreading across my hardwood floors, creeping toward the walls in those organic, vein-like patterns. And from inside the crate came the sound of breathing, slow, deliberate, patient. As if whatever was inside had all the time in the world to wait for the right moment to emerge. I woke up screaming. 3 months have passed since I fled that place in the Kentucky mountains, and I've tried to build a new life here in Oregon. The work at the Portland Museum is routine and comforting, no remote sites, no unexplained artifacts, no midnight drives through forests that feel more alive than they should. Just climate-controlled galleries and carefully cataloged exhibits that tell stories about the past without threatening to drag you into them. But the past has a way of refusing to stay buried. Last week, I received a package with no return address. Inside was a manila envelope containing photocopies of newspaper articles, police reports, and what looked like excerpts from historical documents. A handwritten note was paperclipped to the front. Thought you should know. A friend. The first article was from a local Kentucky newspaper, dated just 2 weeks after my escape from the mining station. The headline read, "Search continues for missing university team." Below it was a photograph showing 4 faces I didn't recognize, presumably James, Robert, Michael, and William, the team that had vanished while trying to complete the collection I'd abandoned. But it was the second article that made my hands start shaking. This one was older, from 1987, with the headline, "Miners Trapped in Cave-In Never Found." The story described a collapse at a mining operation near South Ridge, the same area where Dr. Mantry had said the metal crate was excavated. According to the article, 5 miners had been working a deep shaft when the supports failed. The tunnel had collapsed completely, sealing them inside with no hope of rescue. But what caught my attention was a quote from one of the survivors, a man named Joseph who had been working a different section when the collapse occurred. "We could hear them for 3 days, he told the reporter. Knocking on the rocks, calling for help. But on the 4th day, the sounds changed. Started to sound like they were talking to something else down there. Something that was talking back." The rescue operation had been called off after a week, when it became clear that reaching the trapped miners would be impossible. The article mentioned that strange sounds had continued to emerge from the collapsed area for months afterward, scratching, scraping, and what witnesses described as voices speaking in no language anyone could recognize. The final piece in the envelope was the most disturbing, a historical document that appeared to be from the early 1800s. It was written in faded ink on paper that looked genuinely antique, though I couldn't verify its authenticity. The document was labeled "Account of Strange Discoveries in the Eastern Territories" and was signed by someone named David, who identified himself as a surveyor. David's account described encountering evidence of previous inhabitants in the mountains of what would later become eastern Kentucky. He wrote about finding chambers carved into the living rock that showed signs of long occupation by beings of unusual stature and countenance. Most chilling was his description of artifacts found in these chambers, vessels of unknown metal that reflect no light, bones of massive size arranged in patterns of unclear purpose, and containers sealed with substances that resist all attempts at opening. The document concluded with a warning: the local tribes speak of these places with great fear and will not approach them, claiming that ancient things sleep beneath the mountain and should not be disturbed. I have seen enough to believe their warnings have merit. I tried to dismiss the documents as elaborate hoaxes, but the details were too specific, too consistent with what I'd experienced. Someone had gone to considerable trouble to compile this information and send it to me anonymously. The question was why. I got my answer 2 days later when my phone rang at 3 a.m. Daniel? The voice was weak and hoarse, but unmistakably familiar. Dr. Mandry? Jesus, where are you? Are you all right? I don't have much time. His words came in short bursts, as if he was having trouble breathing. I need to tell you what happened. What I found. Where have you been? People have been looking for you for months. I never left, he said. I've been here the whole time. Down here with them. Down where? Dr. Mandry, you're not making sense. The mine shafts go deeper than anyone realized. Miles deeper. And they're not empty, Daniel. They were never empty. I could hear other sounds in the background, not quite voices, but something that might have been communication. Wet, sliding sounds punctuated by rhythmic clicking. The crate, Dr. Mandry continued, his voice growing more urgent. It wasn't a container. It was a prison. And when it opened, when they came out, they remembered me. They remembered all of us who had disturbed their rest. Dr. Mandry, listen to me. Tell me where you are and I'll come get you. Or call the police. They can. No! The word came out as a sharp whisper. You can't come back here. Promise me you won't come back. They're still looking for you, Daniel. They know you were there when it opened. They know you saw them. The background sounds were getting louder, more insistent. I could hear Dr. Mandry's breathing becoming more labored. They're coming back, he said. I have to go deeper now. Find the others who've been taken. But Daniel, if you ever hear about more disappearances, more people going missing in remote places, you'll know they're spreading. Dr. Mandry. The things we found in that crate, they're just the beginning. There are more containers, more places where the old boundaries have weakened. And every time someone disturbs one of these sites, every time curiosity overcomes caution. The line went dead. I tried calling back, but the number showed as disconnected. I spent the rest of the night researching missing persons reports from remote areas across the Appalachian region. What I found was disturbing, a pattern of disappearances dating back decades, all involving people who had been working alone in isolated locations, researchers, surveyors, hunters, hikers. The reports were scattered across multiple states and jurisdictions, making it difficult to see the pattern unless you knew what to look for. But once I started mapping the locations, a clear picture emerged. The disappearances clustered around areas with a history of mining activity, particularly sites where operations had been abandoned after accidents or unexplained incidents. And in every case, witnesses reported the same details: vehicles found with engines still running, personal belongings left behind, no signs of struggle or violence. Just people who had simply vanished, as if the earth itself had swallowed them. I've been keeping track of these reports, maintaining a private database that no one else knows about. The pattern is accelerating. What used to be isolated incidents every few years are now happening every few months. Something is spreading through the underground spaces beneath the mountains, something that has been waiting far longer than human civilization has existed. Last month, I received another package. This one contained a single photograph, the concrete foundations that Dr. Caldwell had mentioned, the only remaining evidence that the mining station had ever existed. But if you looked closely at the image, if you examined the shadows cast by the surrounding trees, you could see that the foundations weren't quite empty. There were holes in the concrete floor. Perfect circles, each about 3 feet in diameter, leading down into darkness that the camera couldn't penetrate. And around the edges of each hole, the concrete was stained with that same black substance I'd seen seeping from the metal crate. Someone had written a message on the back of the photograph: they're expanding their territory. Others need to know. So now I'm telling you, because I think that's what Dr. Mandry would have wanted. Because maybe if enough people know what to look for, what to avoid, we can prevent others from making the same mistakes we made. Don't go looking for abandoned mining sites in remote areas. Don't investigate strange sounds coming from underground. And if you ever encounter a metal container that doesn't belong, that seems to absorb light rather than reflect it, that makes sounds from within. Walk away. Walk away and don't look back. Because some things are buried for a reason. And some prisons are meant to stay locked forever. The account ends here, but the disappearances continue. If you work in archaeology, geology, or any field that takes you to remote locations, be careful. Be very careful. And if you're ever in the mountains of eastern Kentucky, avoid the area around South Ridge entirely. Some areas of the map are better left unexplored. Found among the personal effects of Daniel Marcus, former collections liaison at Hartwell University Museum, who was reported missing while hiking in the Cascade Range of Oregon. His body was never recovered, but his backpack was found containing this manuscript along with detailed maps marking locations of unexplained disappearances throughout the Appalachian region. The maps have been turned over to federal authorities, but no official investigation has been announced.